I think give a moment for people to join the meeting. I think well, it's okay. I'll start with the presentation. So once you.
Wait, but before we do that, don't we have to take roll?
Take roll, right. I was gonna say, why don't you go ahead with the technical details. The applicants are here as panelists right now, but if you don't mind, we can proceed with those other items even though they're here, but otherwise I could demote them to the audience, but it takes some time to then get them
Oh,
back.
no, it's fine.
Okay.
As panelists, but I feel like we should take
Yes,
roll
oh,
for
definitely.
the board and,
Yes,
and also just follow the standard agenda.
definitely.
I mean, just in case there's public comment on things not relating to the public hearing item. So let me see. It's like there's 16 participants.
So there's 6 people in the audience, including Jerry Holan and Mike Garavaglia, and I don't know if there's others from their team.
Yeah. Is Rich? Oh, I see him, Rich. Okay. So Carol, yeah, Sonia, Rich, me, and Lilia. So the board is all here, but we should take roll.
I could call roll for you.
Okay.
Chair Culhane
Here.
and Carol Goldberg,
Present.
Sonia Gallant,
Here.
Lilia Lance. I'm going to say it wrong, but Lansot.
Well, it's long toe, but it's
Long
versions. But I'm here.
I'm going to say it wrong again, I'm sure later on. And Richard Storick.
Here.
All right, everyone's present, so you have a quorum.
Okay. All right. So this is the moment or the time for public comment for people who may or may not be attending this meeting. If they have any comments that they'd like to make that's not related to the public hearing item number 1. So if anybody here would like to offer anything up, now is the time. If not, I think we should just move right ahead to the planning staff's oral report.
Thank you. So I'm going to see if I can get my, fortunately my notes are in my presentation and it's not picking up my notes. So let me see if I could get it to do that. If anyone is a great expert at PowerPoint and knows how to tell it to put my notes up.
Is there a share screen thing?
Oh yeah, I mean, I could get that up. It's the page with the notes that usually always pops up annoyingly, and this time it's not showing up at all. One moment. I'm gonna I'll have a make a second copy so I could just read on a different screen. Okay, here we go. Okay, hopefully you're looking at just the presentation screen. You're here this evening to consider a project at 7 Ardmore Road. And oops, this is going to be tricky, but I could do this. The site is on Ardmore Road which is on a lot that was created by a 2000 subdivision, or its current configuration was configured by a 2000 subdivision approved by the city. And it's developed with a small cottage that's listed on the Larkspur's historic inventory. The site or the project is to move the historic cottage over on the site and then construct a new residence and associated site improvements like swimming pools and parking area. And I'm actually going to let the project architect describe the project in more detail, so you don't have to hear the presentation twice. But that's the majority of the project, and you all have received the plans for the proposed project. The project needs review by the Heritage Preservation Board, since there is a modification proposed to a listed historic structure. And then the Planning Commission will ultimately decide the project, and they would need to consider the California Environmental Quality Act, and that level of review has not been determined yet. And then they would be considering design review for the new residence, as well as the alterations to the historic structure. And then considering a heritage tree removal permit to remove the California bay tree that's located in the area where the structure is proposed to be moved, as well as removal of a Mexican fan palm and a black acacia on the site. And other trees, the other heritage trees would be preserved at the site. There's also a slope use permit required for the grading at the site, and then a variance would be necessary to allow the cottage to encroach into the required front setback. A small, a small portion of the cottage extends into the required front setback area. Let me go back. So this slide will show the square footage proposed. So the total square footage of the main residence is 3,350 square feet, but the city excludes from floor areas that are 7 feet tall or lower, and areas that are 50% below grade. And so 1,000 square feet of the lower level would be exempt from adjusted floor area. And so the total adjusted floor area proposed is 2,338 square feet. And then the existing cottage is 765 square feet, or it's, sorry, I think it's a little bit larger today, and then would be reduced in size by removal of one of like a little shed off the side. And so the total actual square footage is 4,115 square feet. The adjusted floor area is considered 3,103 square feet, where 3,261 square feet would be permitted for a lot with a slope of 20%. So the Heritage Preservation Board, your job tonight is to determine if the project is compatible with the existing historical resource and also neighboring historical resources, and that the project maintains the integrity of the historic resource and will not significantly diminish public views of the historic resource, will not adversely affect the historic architectural or aesthetic character of the neighborhood, and will comply with federal, state, and city standards for the rehabilitation or modification of historic resources. And I'll come back to the slide in the end, or whenever you need to return to it. The cottage at 7 Ardmore was constructed in the late 19th century on land that was originally claimed by Sea Captain John Van Reinegam in approximately 1860 for use as a ranch. After his death in 1878, his son-in-law Frank Pixley took over the ranch and gave it the name Owl's Wood. Pixley was known for being a former Attorney General of California and the editor of the San Francisco newspaper, The Argonaut. By the 1880s, the Owl's Wood estate had been expanded, and it contained apple and apricot orchards, vineyards, gardens surrounding the broad porched Victorian farmhouse. And the estate had a comfortable farm cottage, a spacious barn and corrals, a modern coach house, a dairy house, and enclosures for cows, pigs, chickens, and other farm animals. And it was even had a stone reservoir and springs that supplied water to the estate. And this is a photo from the Owlswood, a photo of Owlswood from 1887, and it shows a residence on the property with a side gable roof and a central dormer. And the historic architect Garibaglia's report indicates that it's unknown if this residence is the existing cottage at 7 Ardmore, or if it was one of the other buildings that was built on the property but later demolished. Jerry Holland's report indicates the cottage was the first home Frank Pixley built on the estate, and it was probably built sometime between 1860 and 1862 when he purchased the property, and the 1870s. Holland indicates the cottage was carefully sited on the land, and its views are still apparent today, and it has a dominant position on Pixley's estate. The subdivision map shows the main house was also aligned with the contours of the landscape and situated to take advantage of southern views over Corte Madera. It was located in close proximity to the cottage, and there was a clear relationship between the two residential buildings. Holland also says the importance of these views is given by Frank Pixley himself describing his country place in the Argonaut in an ad when it was for sale as that it commands views of the Mount Tamalpais, the bay, and the opposite shores of Contra Costa. And she believes the location of the cottage was significant for Pixley, and its location reflects his Victorian sensitivity to his land. She indicates the cottage location gives its character and integrity, and even amidst its contemporary neighborhood, it retains a sense of place and rural importance. Mr. Pixley died in 1895, and the Pixley family sold the property in 1935, and the city gave the 3 remaining buildings a B rating in the historic inventory in 1977. And then the site was reevaluated in 2007 and given an A rating after the other structures were demolished. This is an old 1919 photo of the cottage, and Holland indicates the proposed original board and batten or horizontal siding shown in this photo may have been finished on different sides during various periods of time. And then these are photos of the cottage from 1975, and Holland indicates the current siding on the cottage is a mineral surface composition sheet covered with battens or sticks, and is probably not the original siding. She believes the siding in these 1975 photos most likely was the original stick siding, and the sticks were decorative elements typical of Eastern stick Victorian homes, which were popular in rural areas in the 1860s and 1870s, and later in the 1880s in California. Stick Victorians typically have decorative sticks in their gables, similar to the ones found on the Owlswood cottage. And she indicates that the use of stick siding on all 3 buildings indicated a conscious application of this style for Pixley's complex of farm buildings.
Hey, you should be more kind about sharing. I was holding it here so we both could see it, and you took my phone and just.
Oh, sorry. Can we all mute? Thanks. The period of significance. Holland indicates the period of significance for the property is the period during the Pixley's ownership of the site between 1860 and 1935. And the period of significance for the main buildings was 1860 to 1880, in which they were constructed. And this is consistent with when the stick style was popular in rural California. Holland also argues there's no documentation other than stick siding for this property, which is consistent with this period of significance. And she therefore believes that in restoring the cottage's siding, it needs to be restored to the stick siding used during the period of significance. She says the stick siding's character defining feature and an integral component of the cottage's Victorian architecture. The siding should be repaired and or replaced in order to retain the integrity of the building. So I wanted to point out there are some areas of agreement between after the original plans were prepared, Holland has done multiple reviews, and the applicant's historical consultant Page and Turnbull did multiple reviews of the structure, or went back and forth. And there are just some areas of agreement, which is the applicant wants to preserve the historic resource and preserve the structure. How they do that is what what you'll be discussing tonight and something that we need to consider. And there's also some agreement on the additional documentations needed for the front port railings and skirting. And so I just wanted to point these out as areas that you probably don't need to discuss. The applicants are intending to do more research from the front port railings and skirting and don't have a concern with doing that. But the main issues that of contention between the two reports that we'd like you to consider tonight are the period of significance for the site, the proposed relocation of the structure, the proposed construction of the new residence, what siding to use on the cottage, and the roofing material. And the city retained Garavaglia, who's the second historical consultant that the city has contracted with to do resource evaluations in order to consider both of those reports so that you would have more information to consider the conflicting information in both of the architectural historian reports. And so they did an evaluation of the two reports and came up with conclusions or in summarized areas of disagreement that I'll review with you tonight. The first is the period of significance. And if the cottage at 7 Ardmore is to be considered historic based on its association with Frank Pixley, Garavaglia believes that the period of significance should be 1878 to 1895. And his analysis is that if the period of Mr. Pixley's association with the property is what gives the cottage most of its significance, then the Secretary of Interior Standards, then the Secretary of Interior Standards for restoration rather than rehabilitation should be considered. And this would mean that any additions or alterations done after 1895 would be removed and reverted back to the period when Frank Pixley was associated with the property. Go back. The next significant area of disagreement is the proposed relocation of the structure. And Garavaglia is in agreement with Page and Turnbull and cites the regulations from the California Environmental Quality Act related to adverse impact on a historic resource in their report. They find that the relocation of the cottage is inconsequential to the building's historic character due to its characteristics of the site and environment already having been lost with the amount of development around the property. The proposed slight relocation does not conflict with the original character and use of the historic resource, as the character would be retained through the building form and the building would still be used as a dwelling as it was historically. And they believe it would still retain eligibility for listing on the California National Register through the association with Pixley. And as noted in the Holon report, she believes that the structure would lose its integrity by being moved and would no longer qualify for state and federal listing or for, it should be removed from the local historic register if it's moved. The siding is another area of disagreement, and Garavaglia believes the majority of the siding was board and batten, not stick style. And as a restoration, in-kind replacement of the board and batten siding would be appropriate and in line with the Secretary of Interior standards. And Garavaglia indicates the stick style siding was likely a stylistic choice that was made after the building's period of significance and was adopted to match the other buildings on the site, which are no longer extant. They did observe the original board siding underneath the existing composition sheet and batten siding, and staining and absence of surface paint indicated the location of the original battens. Cut nails were observed in the boards, indicating they were likely the original materials dating from the cottage's construction. And they also observed board and batten siding on the interior of the building. And here's some photos that they had in their report showing that you could see at the site underneath the material, showing the boards underneath. Another area of disagreement is whether or not to allow the metal roofing that's proposed on the cottage. And everyone agrees that the original home did not have metal roofing, but and wood roofing would have been common at the time the cottage was constructed. But Garavaglia concludes that the structure has had modern roofing materials for a long time, and the roof surfaces don't define a high level character defining feature, but the actual form of the roof is a character defining feature. So Garavaglia, the firm, proposed, they believe the proposed roofing materials would have the weathered look and visual quality of shingles and would be visually compatible with the building while still being differentiated from the historic materials. And then finally, the proposed new construction is an area of disagreement, and the Jerry Holon believes that the new home overwhelms and diminishes the historic cottage in its scale, proportions, and massing. The applicant did go and the Garavaglia report had agreed to some extent with that finding and did recommend some revisions, and the applicant went and revised the elevations and separated the building, I believe, a little bit more in order to respond to the concerns. And Jerry Holon or Page and Trimble, neither of them have had an opportunity to respond to the modified design. But Garavaglia does believe that the proposed design, with some minor modifications to the entry of the new house to improve its relationship to the cottage and possibly provide more separation between the two structures, that the proposed revisions are consistent with the Secretary of Interior standards. And so again, your job this evening is to consider whether or not findings can be made to find that the resource is essentially being protected. And we have Garavaglia Architecture here tonight. I see Jerry Holon is in the audience as well. And what I'd like to do is turn the application over to the applicant to describe the project in more detail. And so you could hear more about the considerations that they made in designing the site and coming up with the design that they're proposing and the proposal to modify the structure. And then I would suggest returning for discussion, but we do have experts here that could answer questions that you have as you consider whether or not you can recommend the structure to the Planning Commission. And again, like I said in the staff report, I think it's probably a good idea just to focus on the areas of disagreement to try to limit the scope of your discussion. And it's totally fine to pick any report, any conclusion. They're all done by qualified architectural historians. They're all based on information. I mean, you have discretion to side with the report that you're most comfortable with. And we hope that we've provided you with enough information to come up with some conclusions on some of these issues of disagreement. So that would conclude my staff report, unless you have questions, and I'm happy to, we could listen to the presentation by the applicant and then return if you have additional questions from me. Stop my screen share.
Elise, I have a question here. We have a number of people under the name of Ellen and Steve. How do we tell who's who?
Why don't we let them, they might have different audio. I'll let them introduce the team here and the property owners. And I'm gonna turn my screen off because I'm getting a call from someone that I know is probably trying to attend the meeting. So I'm going to try to help that person while they make their presentation.
Ellen and Steve, I think you were gonna.
Okay, yes, hi. I too was confused. I see a lot of people with my name on the screen, but I am the real Ellen Hotung here. So I just wanted to introduce myself, and together with my husband, Steve Boyd, we are the applicants of 7 Ardmore Road. I should be sharing a screen with my husband, but he unfortunately had to go on a trip out of town. However, he too is here under the name of Ellen Hotung and Steve Boyd. There he is. And in just a moment, I'm going to introduce him. But I first wanted to just give a sincere thank you to all of you for taking the time to review our application and to be here tonight. It is greatly appreciated. Thank you. You're probably wondering about us, who we are, and what our connection is with Larkspur. I'm going to be brief because I want to be respectful of your time. Steve and I are longtime Park City locals. We've been here for 30 odd years, and we have 3 children who are born and raised here in Park City. We've been very involved in our community. We love our small town of Park City, and we are great supporters of education, arts, and community foundation. We're both very outdoorsy, active people. We like to spend our time hiking and mountain biking, bike riding. We even ride a tandem. We are that couple. We are very passionate about our tandem, and we've ridden actually quite a lot in Larkspur. We actually keep one there. And of course we ski, because it's practically a law here in Park City that you have to ski, because I think you'd go nuts in the wintertime if you didn't do something outside. I'm a fair skier. My husband's a very good skier. But the fact is that the winters here have they've gotten too long for me, and for Steve too. We're either waiting for snow, or we're deep in snow, as we are now, thanks to all the California rain, got a lot of snow, or we're waiting for the snow to melt. And it takes up about 8 months of winter season, where unless you're skiing or you're hiking and sledding, you're not outside enjoying the outdoors. And we are just great lovers of the outdoors. So, our children are 25, 24, and 19. We are sort of recent empty nesters, and we're looking for that next chapter. I'm going to turn it over to Steve to introduce himself, but then I'd just like another moment of your time after that to tell you what our connection is to Larkspur. So Steve.
Again, I'll keep it quick. And again, thank you for attending tonight. I moved to Park City 32 years ago. I was finishing up a career as a professional cyclist. Sports have been a big part of my life. I grew up racing sailboats back east. I was captain of the sailing team at the University of Rhode Island. And hence, I'm looking forward to getting back to the water. But as I said, I'm a 23-year, I haven't, retired fire captain with Park City Fire District. I'm a Rotarian here in town. I've spent lots of time volunteering different organizations around town. I am a coach. I helped bring the Park City lacrosse program, youth program, got it started 15 years ago. And today it's one of the top lacrosse programs in the state, which is awesome. I love being part of the community. I'm one of those guys that walks in the grocery store and, I kind of know everybody. I go in the coffee shop. That's who I am. I love being known around town. And I love talking to people. That's kind of one of my things. So I'm really looking forward to a new chapter and heading to Larkspur and doing all the things that Larkspur has to offer, from hiking, biking, running. I still love to race a little bit. So that's kind of one of the things that's really driving, both of us to Larkspur, is all the things that Larkspur has to offer.
Yes, well, we don't have to tell you all how great it is. You all are fortunate to live there, and we hope to live there soon as well. So why Larkspur? What's the connection? My best friend, whom I've known since I was 13 years old, has lived in Marin for about 30 years, but Larkspur for the past 20. She and I speak every day, sometimes a couple times a day. Yeah, my husband's laughing. So in any event, we know the Larkspur, lifestyle. We love it. I think one of the things I love most about it is I don't have to get in my car to go anywhere. I can just walk out if we were to be so lucky to live at 7 Ardmore, could walk out my door and do all the things that Steve suggested we love to do. We found out about this property over COVID. Apparently it had been on the market for a few months. And my friend and I were talking one day and she said, oh my gosh, there's this really special property. No one's made any offers on it. It does have, a cottage on it, but any chance you'd want to come out and take a look at it. Well, of course, we'd been stuck in the house for a long time, but we jumped at the opportunity to get in our car and drive 12 hours, actually, that was it, to Larkspur. And we came upon the property and we fell in love with it. The charm of the cottage, the location on the quiet cul-de-sac, 5-minute walk from town. Just everything that we really love. And we're excited and we're passionate about rehabilitating the cottage. We're willing to take it on, and we unfortunately it's in disrepair. It's uninhabitable right now, and sadly it's been vandalized recently. So we hope to make it useful and to again be able to enjoy this charming cottage. As we mentioned, we've been in Park City 30 years. We're ready for the next chapter, and we hope it's going to be 30 years in Larkspur. So thank you all so much for your consideration of Steve and me and our application. And I'm gonna let the experts take it from here. And of course, if you have any questions of us, please don't hesitate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Who are the other Ellens?
I'm Victoria Love, and I live in Larkspur, and I've been here for about 17 years. I live in a 1906 home.
The other Ellen is, can you hear me? The other Ellen is me. I'm Tina MacArthur, and I've lived in Larkspur since 1985, and love it so much. So I think it would be a wonderful gift to have Ellen and Steve here. I really do.
And sorry to interrupt, but because they haven't started taking public comments yet, I'm sure they want to hear from all the Ellens that are here. But I think just to expedite or keep things moving along, I'm going to move all the Ellens to the audience, but we'll call on you after the presentation.
Fine.
So everyone gets a chance to hear the presentation. So Kirsten, you're muted, but if you could, if there's no more of the owners speaking, and if we could do that, and the committee will get back to taking public comments.
I think we're ready.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm Kirsten Fisher. This is Andrew Fisher, Fisher Architecture. So good evening, board members and Elise, and thank you for making time to discuss our project this evening. A quick introduction of us. We're a Berkeley-based firm, and we specialize in single-family residential homes, both new homes and renovations. And many of our projects have involved working with landmark and historically significant homes in the East Bay, San Francisco, and Marin County. We've completed a number of projects in Larkspur over the past 15 years or so, and we're getting ready to break ground on a in February on a pretty big renovation just a few blocks away from the Owlswood Cottage over on William Avenue. We love this area and we always look forward to working in Larkspur. Our vision for the project, for Ellen and Steve's project, started with honoring the cottage. We recognized its fine, distinct character and wanted to find a way for that to remain intact on all four sides. What we found ourselves wanting was to create a home for Ellen and Steve that could preserve the cottage as a discrete standalone structure. At 735 square feet, the cottage is a small home by today's standards. And understandably, Ellen and Steve's programmatic needs required that we create more living space on the site. However, it felt to us that adding onto the cottage with an addition would overly compromise its massing. We wanted to avoid disrupting it with the encumbrance of an addition. Of course, there are several other unique constraints that also help shape the project that's before you this evening. The site is irregularly shaped and configured on a 20% upslope lot. And with the private shared drive, the site has more adjacent neighbors than usual. Working with adjacent neighbors on any project is critical, and we wanted to make sure that we found ways to incorporate the specific needs of these important near neighbors. There's also a cluster of heritage-sized coast-live oak trees in the southwest corner of the lot, which we wanted to work to preserve. And I'll turn it over to Anthony.
Yeah, so I have a few notes here just because I have a tendency to drone on, and I know that everybody's time is valuable here. So I'll just speak to how we kind of approach the project and how it took the shape and form that is in front of you now. So just as a kind of a repeat, I think our primarily our observation was that we felt that keeping the cottage as a separate standalone building best allowed us to fully consider and execute its rehabilitation with the idea of preserving the resource, stabilizing it, and continuing its life for many years to come, basically. Our solution involved repositioning the cottage to the site, on the site closest to the public right-of-way, making it broadly visible from Ardmore Road. In addition, we worked with the topography to maintain its height relative to the adjacent grade, kind of as close to the original relationship as possible. In addition, with this approach, we've had the opportunity to preserve the original function of the Owlswood Cottage as an ancillary residence to a primary home. The cottage's proposed classification currently as an ADU to the new residence on the site is logical and in keeping with its history and build. Speaking to the proposed new structure, we have a single-story residence. We're proposing a single-story residence that's located behind the cottage in the central flat portion of the site and in the area of its southwest upslope. The new residence maintains its own relationship to grade, with the main living level approximately 4 feet higher than that of the cottage. Its architecture is informed by the agrarian vernacular of the cottage, its gable and shed roof forms, rough stone wood siding atop a rough stone base with wood windows and a dull colored zinc standing seam roof. The guest bedrooms that double as home offices are in the section of the building behind the cottage, while the primary bedroom wing borders the south side of the lot. The center of the home contains the combined living, dining, and kitchen functions, and the square of these spaces occupies a massing similar in footprint, roof form, and overall massing to that of the cottage. Required parking is located underground beneath the house and behind the earth and stone walls of the building base. We'll also note that the required parking for the new residence is behind the cottage in its new location so that the resource is not obscured by garage doors. So speaking to what we're doing basically in general with the sites and how we're dealing with other aspects besides the cottage and the primary residence, the pool is located along the western edge of the property. It's located within the rear setback as permitted by the ordinance. This allows us, to accommodate this need while providing as much room as possible on the site to locate the two structures. The pool is also positioned such as to maintain the health of the cluster of live oak trees southwest corner of the lot. The site will be landscaped to include 6 new mature native trees, as well as a variety of other shrubs and screen plantings that will maintain privacy for and from adjacent neighbors. We have provided separate and distinct entrances to both the cottage and the primary residence, with the new residence having a more formal curved entry stair to the south, while the cottage will maintain a low-key entry stair in its current position on the south side of its front porch. We acknowledge staff and the consultant historian's request for further study of the cottage stair and look forward to working with them to refine this design for better compatibility. We've been involved with this project now for some time, incorporating feedback from neighbors and from the Larkspur Planning Department into several iterations and refinements of the proposal. We are very pleased with the results and are confident that this is a very appropriate design in response to the homeowner's needs as well as those of the city and the neighborhood. We feel at this point we're down to a few final issues that staff would like us to resolve, namely, as we mentioned, the cottage skirting and the railings. And as mentioned a moment ago, the access stair to the cottage. We certainly look forward to undertaking further site exploration at staff requests to see what evidence there might be on the building that describes what the original skirting and railings might have been. And luckily, at least showed us that photo earlier. We have the photo of the cottage from 1919. That photo is of the south side of the cottage, and while the photo shows an old porch that's no longer there, it does offer us good guidance of what the original railings skirting might have been on the east side. And we look forward to working with staff, as we said, and the city's consultant historian to come up with the most appropriate and compatible solution. So that sort of I think describes what we're putting in front of you and some of the reasons behind where we are where we are in terms of the design approach. So.
And Elise, I'll just note that earlier in your introduction, you noted that both Jerry Halon and Mike Garavaglia are in the attendees section. So is Stacy Kozakovich from Page and Trimble, in case that you have any questions for her.
Okay.
I think we're finished.
Yeah.
Now.
I mean, I'm sure there's
Okay.
questions that
Yeah.
I'm happy to kind of get into more detail. But like I said, it's a general outline of our proposal.
There's a lot of material on the record. You've had probably a large packet to review. So like we said, in the interest of everybody's time, we didn't want to go through all the details, but it's been an iterative process. Lots of kind of pushing and pulling back and forth, small adjustments here and there, trying to kind of lock everything into place. So as Andrew mentioned, we're sort of feel like we're very pleased with where it's landed. Things are all sort of fallen into place nicely, and with the exception of these, what seems like these last few items to resolve, we're very pleased to bring this project to you.
I'm anxious to hear what you have to say.
Would you, I could change the role to attendee. And I don't know if you'd like to just go into receiving public comment, or you'd like to hear from the Garavaglia, the city's architectural peer reviewer, and ask any questions. I could bring him up.
Well, if we bring him up, so then we also have
Any-
Page and Turnbull. And we also
Anyone,
have
yeah. Or
Jerry
if you want to
Halon.
just ask questions, that's fine.
So this is kind of a first for us to have 3 separate historic architects available. I mean, it's nice to have the resource. I wonder if there's anything that they'd like to add beyond what they've put in their reports.
I guess I would, That's a great question. So if any of the architectural historians have anything to add, please raise your hand so we know that you have something to add, and then we can call on you. Okay, Mr. Garavaglia has raised his hand, so I'm going to let him speak. All right, you should be able to, oh, there you are. We can see you
All
now.
right,
Thanks.
technology. Okay, thank you. Hi, Mike Garavaglia, Garavaglia Architecture. I think that the thing I'd like to say is that it's a complicated property because of the nature of changes that occurred over time and how to align the building with maybe the best history associated with that property. And that's kind of why you have these different reports, all obviously professionally prepared. There's certain kind of lenses that one might look at as the building sits there today. So that's kind of how we wound up agreeing with some issues, not agreeing with other issues, and trying to balance the conditions. We saw a few things that were just maybe had been, I won't say overlooked, but maybe not prioritized. So that's kind of how we got. And I can appreciate the complexity of your position. Yes, three different presenters or evaluators is a lot, but it's a complicated property and obviously important to the community. So happy to answer any questions that might be specific, but just wanted to let you know that that's kind of how we got to where we were. So.
Jerry Holon is raising her hand, so I will allow her to speak. Oh, there we go. So you should be able to unmute yourself.
Okay, am I here?
Yeah, we could hear you now.
Great. Okay, I can't see myself, but am I on? Oh, I got to turn the video on. There we go. Yeah, hi there. Yeah, and I totally agree with Mike, what Mike just said. And if you got a fourth report, you'd get a fourth opinion. So I think that's the nature of having so many professionals look at it. I will say that the Page and Turnbull consultant was hired by the owner, so they are going to be partial to the project. And I think the main areas that we dispute in is mainly the relocation. The handrails, I think more investigation is fine. The roofing material, I'm not so sure is such a big deal. According to the most recent plans, which I just pulled offline yesterday, Fisher Architecture is now proposing metal shingles or asphalt shingles, and I would highly recommend the asphalt shingles. So I'm not sure that the shingles are a big point of contention. And I think regarding the siding, that's another area that's a little confusing because the latest plans from December 2022 do in fact show the East Lake siding as the finished siding. The board and batten siding shown in their October 21 plans was what they proposed the last time I looked at the plans. The board and batten was the original siding on this farm. But when the Pixleys built their main house in the East Lake stick style, it was covered in East Lake stick style siding. And that is the period of significance. And that is what we should be trying to achieve with the siding. So I'm not sure how far apart we are because I haven't heard from Fisher Architecture regarding that, their last set of plans versus their October 21 set of plans. So we might not be in disagreement. I think we need to put back the East Lake siding. I don't know what you're going to use instead of the composition mineral sheet, but I'm sure you could come up with something. But it was very common for older farms to start with a little cabin. And then as they prospered, they built the main house. And then the little cabin is then refinished with something to match the main house. And that's exactly what we saw at the Murray house. If you recall, they had a one-room cabin. The farm prospered. They built a two-story main house in Gothic Victorian, and then they made the little cabin match. So this is a very common feature, and the argument would only be what period of significance we're going to. I'm suggesting that it's 1880, and I think Mike might be suggesting that the 1860 or 70 original siding. Other than that, we can talk about the location. That's going to be, I think, the big points that we need to look at. So, thank you.
Page and
Okay,
Turnbull.
and then believe this is the Page and Turnbull consultant that I'm promoting now to panelist.
Hi
Correct.
there. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Stacy Kozakevich. I work with Page and Turnbull, and I've been working with Fisher Architecture on this project. I just have a couple of points that I'd like to share. The first is that even though we are working for the project proponent, our commitment to professionalism and objectivity means that we are not acting in a way that is partial to the project. We are acting in a way that is prioritizing the evidence that we have found regarding this property. And so I think you can be assured that any of the findings in our reports are based on our research and our professional opinions, not on any agenda or desire to further the project in any way. Second, just with respect to the complexity of the property, as Mike Garavaglia had mentioned, and the kind of way that cottages evolved over time, as Jerry Holland mentioned, I think it's important to consider that this cottage has a long history of alteration, that it is, I don't want to say far-fetched to assume that what we see on the outside actually represents original material from the 1870s. But I think that we need to be fair and acknowledge that every building that has been occupied for a long period of time has experienced various eras of change. And so, for example, after the Owlswood estate passed out of Pixley ownership in the early 1920s, there was an attempted era of development within which the property was proposed to be developed as a residential area called Chevy Chase, a name which stuck with it for decades. And a 1923 newspaper article from the San Anselmo Herald described that the proposed look of the development was to be what was called an English style. The article says, Owlswood has been changed in name to Chevy Chase after a delightful residential section of that name in Washington, D.C. Avenues and buildings of English style will be laid out, forming an English village effect, with families of Army and Navy men mainly as occupants. So this is another chapter in the history of this neighborhood where the existing buildings were incorporated into this proposed development. And we need to acknowledge the potential for renovations and alterations to the exterior subsequent to the Pixley's use. And so looking at the existing, what looks like stick siding might not necessarily represent that early era. So I think, like Mike said, we just need to embrace the possibility for some complexity and look at the evidence that we have and excavate as though we are building archaeologists to find what appears to be, based on what is present, the earliest and most appropriate representative of its significance. I'm going to leave it at that, just again, in the interest of everybody's time. And thanks again for considering all of our input and this project's applicant.
Thank you. Okay. Elise, do you think it's better to go to the board having questions of what we've just heard, or should we open it up to public comment, or what do you think?
I would start with questions now and then open it up to public comment. I think that would be, or that's a traditional order at our meetings.
Okay.
And then we can call on anyone you need if it's not, the question's not for me.
All right. Well, let's start with questions from the board.
Do you want us to raise our hands somehow? or just speak out?
I'm okay with you speaking out. You seem to take your turns.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask a little more about the relocation, because it had been my understanding through the years that relocating a historic building was really something that often took it off of whatever register it was on. So I'm curious how this doesn't seem to be a really big deal in this case.
And I would like to call on Mr. Garavaglia, which I'm probably not saying his last name correctly, to respond to that. And I think there is, I've just heard from workshops I've attended that not all experts agree on this issue too. And then there's some components of this question that are related to CEQA and moving things offsite entirely as opposed to shifting something on a site. So, but I would like to call on one of the experts to respond since they're the experts. So I'm going to ask Mr. Garavaglia if he could respond to that first. Let's see.
Okay, very good question. And again, one of the very complicated pieces of a project like this. Relocation of buildings is in fact something that we avoid at all costs. But under some circumstances, it's appropriate and does not necessarily affect the significance, the historic significance of the property. We evaluate this sort of an issue under the National Register evaluation process. There are a series of what they call criteria considerations, and one of those criteria consideration B is regarding moved properties. So they talk about when it's appropriate or inappropriate to move an historic property. Under CEQA, any kind of change to the property that would essentially make it no longer eligible, no longer historically significant, is an impact. Relocations are something that's considered as long as we don't lose the historic significance of the property, thus linking to the criteria consideration. For a property associated with persons, the most remaining property, the most important property remaining is appropriate to potentially consider for relocation because it is the final property associated. Also, for different types of architecture, this building is an early homesteader's cottage cabin, and obviously there aren't many of those. So it's a pretty rare example of an early structure. The building is only being moved a little bit, so you consider the 7 aspects of integrity. Some of those have to do with the structure itself, like material design. Others, other aspects are things about feeling, association, setting. Those aspects are more about the environment around the cottage, and that environment, which is pretty heavily diminished from its original period and different configurations under Pixley. There's a lot of homes surrounding the property now, so that part of the environment's eroded, or the historical integrity of that is diminished. It's still in a forest. It's pretty obvious that the setting is heavily wooded, and it's on a slope. It faces the street. It hasn't changed its orientation really to its access. So, and the height above grade, which is important to maintain, there's a lot of continuity in that. So that's why we feel that the relocation is not a significant impact. I would not move this building down the street. I would not turn the building around, but this sort of a shift is under criterion consideration B, we feel is acceptable and does not severely affect the integrity of the building. If the So I'll leave it at that because I can drone on at length. So I'll stop now.
So I just have a quick question. You mentioned criterion B. You're talking about the National Register eligibility or the local
Yes.
status and National Register eligibility criteria?
We use the National Register evaluation process pretty thoroughly. State of California has aligned their evaluation process with the National Register, and thus CEQA is really working with National Register processes. And so those are more formalized under than other, especially local evaluation processes. So it's common knowledge. It's easily accessed. It's a common language to work with, and that's how we've looped it in. And primarily under it's kind of a CEQA hook, so to speak, regarding how to evaluate the integrity of the property if it were to be relocated. So the criterion consideration provides a direct methodology, so to speak, to do that evaluation.
Okay.
And
So
we
that's
have
the evaluation of physical integrity, basically.
well, the 7 aspects of integrity, which again, getting into kind of arcane parts here, but there's.
Oh, no, it's not arcane.
Okay, so you're familiar with, okay, so that's the setting, yes, predominantly, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, association, design.
Yes.
Yeah.
I had a little bit of a follow-up to that. The reason you're moving it is it's so central to the lot that it would be very difficult to build a home somewhere else on the lot that's suitable for the buyers.
I think that, I think that's true, that in order, well, there could be another structure built, and I think they considered an addition off the back, which would be an alternative, but it would involve a significant amount of grading because the slope changes back there. And then also the structure that would be built could dwarf would be an appendage on the cottage and could dwarf the historic structure. So they did explore that, but elected, thought this was a better solution to allow them to build a new structure.
But there's actually space to the west of the cottage on the lot. I mean, there's room if you wanted to.
Behind into the rear?
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about building to the rear, but there's space to the west as well.
Right. Right. And so and then if the structure was designed there, we'd be going through this whole process for how it impacts the cottage too. So,
True.
I mean,
True.
but yes, there's other places to construct the residence without moving it. It just, they have their own limitations.
I had just, since we're talking about the relocation, in Jerry's report, she discussed like that, the location being important to the history of it. And I live in a house sort of like that, where when I drove up to look at 7 Ardmore, its position and its sort of prominence, even though it's a small structure, it's very prominent as you drive down that small road. And then I'm not sure, maybe I don't understand like grading and how the slope would change, but if it were moved, it looks like it would move like closer to the street. And if you're standing on the street, it moves closer to the street and to the right, which was further down. So I don't know if I really quite understand how it maintains its status, I guess, on that slope, particularly if you're going to put a house on the slope, which I just think that would be much higher then, but that's not how it looks in the rendering. So if you could just like explain the grading part to me a little bit, that would be helpful.
So is that question, like, is that more a question about the design and how it's being tucked in there? Why it doesn't look like it's taller?
Yeah, like how does it work so that it doesn't look like the new house would be like way hot taller?
Well,
than
part of it is because of the 470 or so cubic yards of grading to keep it as a single story structure. And the I mean, it might be better to have the architect explain that more clearly, because they'll know exactly what that entailed, if you don't mind me bringing them up to answer that.
Thank you.
Could I get back to, for a moment, the proposed relocation of the cottage? Since, I mean, we could wait and talk about the grading if you prefer, but I did want to ask about Mr. Garavalia's report, where he talked about the proposed relocation of the cottage would be inconsequential to the building's historic character. And I'm quoting, and due to the characteristics of the site and the environment already having been lost with the amount of development around the property. And I understand that. But when you stand on the street and look at the site and the cottage itself, you're looking at a cottage that's centered on the lot, that's got, you know, wooded area and grass around it. So yeah, looking out from the cottage, you might not have Mr. Pixley's view of, you know, Corte Madera and the cornfields, but I think we have to keep in mind what it's like for Larkspur residents and visitors that are standing on the street looking at this cottage, and how it is really going to change if we move it from its centerpiece kind of location to kind of bringing it closer to the street. Of course, it's more prominent, but it's also going to lose its setting and its feeling. So I just wanted to make sure we're, you know, seeing that perspective.
Thank you, Hillary. I think you like clarified exactly what I was thinking, but didn't know quite how to ask. So thank you.
I would say the relocation has been characterized as slight.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see that. It looks to me like a really substantial relocation, and that's my biggest problem with this project is what's happened to the location of that historic building.
Well, again, an important aspect of this, part of it, these evaluations, we put the 7 aspects of integrity tend to shift based on the nature of association. So the construction materials, the design of the property, the workmanship, those sorts of aspects are much more present in this property as it relates to Pixley. The setting, association, and feeling, the feeling is gone, pretty much gone. It's in a forest, but it's not it doesn't feel at all anymore like a ranch property. So all those characteristics have been heavily diminished. The setting also has been heavily modified. The demolition of 2 of the other structures associated with the property are gone. So if Pixley came back to the property today and saw his original cabin and his other properties gone, what would he be looking at? And what would be kind of the most important pieces of that? It's understandable about and that's why we look at orientation, height above grade. We have talked about the nature of the guardrail and the wall below the porch and how those meet the grade, trying to maintain that relationship so that it's not significantly modified. So moving that relationship over is the goal for this. And I mean, all I can say is that that's how we've evaluated these kinds of properties under criterion consideration B. We have moved National Register buildings and which is mandatory to discuss that prior to relocation, and have maintained the designation through after relocation. So it is doable. There's maybe preferential aspects to this particular setting, and of course you're in a position to make those kinds of determinations. But from our evaluation, it's not an unreasonable process to move the building as being proposed. We again have talked about some refinements to improve how the building sits on the ground and that experience that you have as you kind of come up to the front of the building. But again, a lot of the more ephemeral aspects of integrity have already been pretty heavily diminished. So that's one of the reasons why we're not as concerned about the relocation. So,
Mike, I would guess I would like to answer your question, and channeling Mr. Pixley, I think if I came back, I'd be shocked to see how much my cottage has been encroached upon. Mm-hmm. And if that then renders it moot, whether it's further diminished, I'd be concerned about that.
Yeah. Understood. I've tried to kind of present the analysis process to you, and again, this is one of the complex aspects of it, trying to weigh those different aspects of integrity based on the project changes and even under some of the environmental review laws. This is what we've seen patterns like this and have seen it be successfully implemented. So it's not preferential, but it is something that is conceivable and it can be analyzed. If maybe a more thorough analysis under the criterion consideration would assist with that, but at this stage, I'm pretty confident about how I presented it and what my feelings are. And I understand your feelings too, of course.
I'm trying to understand, and I'm concerned about the relocation, but if it doesn't get relocation, practically speaking, then we're talking about some kind of addition on the property. And that obviously has its own impacts. And the property obviously needs to be restored in some fashion because it's clearly terribly deteriorated. So I guess that would be one of my questions, maybe for one of the experts, is I'm sure you've looked at the alternatives, and the alternative would be an addition. Is that correct, to the property that's there?
That's my understanding. Well, let's let the architects respond to that.
So I can try and maybe fill in some of those gaps. I think, look, we've been asked to develop this property, so it's a home that Ellen and Steve, their kids, their grandkids can use, right? It's a 750 square foot cottage that's on the site right now. Obviously doesn't accommodate closely, remotely, that kind of need. So there has to be some significant programmatic change to this property to make it livable, right? So our approach, of course, immediately you see it all over the place, is you got sometimes you just will keep some token element of a facade and then add some massive addition onto the back. I think that our analysis of this, and one of the reasons why we're attracted to it, and I think Ellen and Steve really fell in love with the cottage, was thinking of it in its entirety. It's really hard to imagine that building with kind of a large addition added to it, or wings added to it.
I'll note that when we started the project, that was, we started from that place. We started from the idea of putting additions onto it. And we found very quickly that it felt like the building was turning into sort of a peacock with the cottage where it was, and then a lot of building up around it. And because it's up the hill, we either needed to take out the oak trees and dig way down to maintain the same floor level, or we needed to build up, or even a two-story. You mentioned the kind of area to the southwest. There is kind of a square piece of property there that's within the setback that sort of feels buildable enough, but it's also only accommodating about 700 square feet of footprint. So we need to make it 2 stories. So now we were looking at a building that was a 2-story addition on the back of the cottage, which felt like it was most certainly looking down and looming over the cottage. So we didn't like that idea. Ellen and Steve had also entertained the idea of including an ADU in the program for their, their grown children when they come to visit. And so we we explored where an ADU could go, and this was all part of the original idea of adding on to the cottage. And the ADU found itself over a 2-car garage, sort of in the front where we have the cottage right now. And at the time we looked at that, we thought, well, that totally obscures the view to the cottage. Now you can't see it at all because now we've got a garage. We have to get covered parking in here. We got to get 2 covered parking spaces plus 2 guest parking spaces. And all of that's got to go right in front of the historic cottage. So in that moment, we thought, well, wait a minute, if we want to try to include an ADU in this project, the cottage is kind of the ADU. It's the right size, and that allows us to restore it as it is on, keep the whole building intact and not add on to it, not tear off the back and build out beyond, which, you could never restore that. And by moving it towards the front, we can tuck that required vehicular parking down and underground, so it's not there. Now, as a gesture to this private cul-de-sac where parking is really impacted, we have, Ellen and Steve have included a little overflow parking for the night they had a dinner party or whatever. Those 2 spaces you see in front of the cottage in its new location. But the intent is that the cars go in the garage behind the building, and so you aren't looking at a bunch of cars parked in front of the cottage.
But wait, the plans are different though. I thought that there's parking kind of where the car port is currently in front of the cottage, and then there's a driveway.
Yeah, that's not required parking. The required parking is the 2 parking spaces in the garage down below, the 2 in the driveway out in front of that. As I was saying, Ellen and Steve did, and kind of as a gesture to the cul-de-sac where parking is really impacted, included those extra spaces as overflow parking, but they're not required. The 2 that are in front of the cottage.
The 2 that are in front of the cottage, okay.
Yeah, they're not required. That was just, again, in this long process, in talking to the neighbors, they were concerned about parking. We found the opportunity to provide a couple of extra spots, some DG, if, for when they have the dinner party or whatever, but.
Okay.
I just want to add, just to further the kind of idea of relative movement of this cottage, right? If you look at moving the cottage on this, site that was subdivided in the 1980 or 1990 or whenever it was, it became bigger estate. Now it's down to 10,000 or 11,000 square feet. Sure, moving it anywhere on the site relative to those boundaries makes it look significant. If you actually think about it in terms of the entirety of the Pixley estate, acres and acres and acres, it's insignificant. And if Mr. Pixley were to come back, I don't think he would necessarily even be able to orient himself to where he is, other than this is generally where my property was and where the cottage was. I think really the relationship he would look at, or I, would be, how is it, what's the materiality of it? How does it maintain the original kind of idea of it as a small building, and how does it sit relative to the grade on the site? And if you kind of think about, if you were to wipe out all of those other houses and pavement and all that other stuff and restore the original site conditions, I don't think you'd even know that it was moved, right? I think it's really hard and emotional to think about the cottage as it is in its current state, because it is kind of propped up and kind of sitting right smack in the middle of the property, which doesn't really, it just sort of monumentalizes it and just leaves it intact and is on display. I think it's important to note too that I think a lot of the perspective and how the public views this building should really be considered from Ardmore. That from that gate or that position of that driveway back to the cul-de-sac is, you're entering kind of private property, right? That's not part of the public's domain. So our thought is positioning this thing closer to the public domain and putting it in a more prominent part of the site would be better gesture to the community in terms of how they can see the site. As you walk down Ardmore, you can't see the building very well, right? So it's like, unless you kind of walk up that private drive, that's when you get a good glimpse of the property. So I think that our analysis showed that kind of when you're on Ardmore, you will be able to have a better kind of visual connection to the cottage than you currently have now. So that was kind of our thought process there, you know. And then, you know, if there are other questions about grading, you know, we can kind of get into the details of that, but Kirsten sort of said it. The more you connect to it, you got to either lower one or raise one, and then now the relationship to grade is completely out of whack, and or, you know, your kind of building forms don't make any sense, you know, in terms of their, you know, kind of everyday enjoyment. This seemed to be and I honestly going there and seeing the story poles and getting a better visual, like a three-dimensional and massing visualization. I'm even more confident that the solution that we came up with is the right one. So.
Can I follow up on these storyboards, because I did look at them. And I'm looking at your new drawings that you just submitted. It's hard to tell if the cottage is how much taller the new house is versus the cottage when I look at your drawings here.
I can suggest that you turn to, or maybe at least you can go to A 4.0. I think that's what the recently revised submittal.
Okay, I'll pull it up. Let me share my screen.
I have it.
Well, if you can all see it, I can look at it here.
And I see it. I'm still a little unclear when I look at that. It's
Yeah.
just
So I think if you look at
a bit taller to me. I'm just curious.
yeah,
About 4 feet taller.
well, the floor level, again, maintain both buildings and put them in the relationship to natural grade in the best possible position. So basically, the buildings are just kind of sliding back and forth on the site. So we've taken the cottage and sort of slid it down the hill along the topographic line. So all of those points at which the grade meet the building are the same as they were in the original position. And that's the same approach we took to the building, the main residence. So it's sitting on grade, so it is represented as a one-story building. And of course, we're sliding it up the hill. So we are kind of, the building is sliding up with it. So the difference between those floor levels is about 4 feet. But the building, the new primary residence and the cottage actually are about the same height to each other.
Relative to each other, that's right.
Yeah, so you can kind of see it in this section. The drawing on the lower part of the page kind of illustrates that kind of sliding up the site, as it were. And the primary residence actually occupies the floor level that the cottage currently has. So as an elevation mark, I think it's 95 is the datum point, and that's where the cottage is currently. So we've just kind of slid them around the site so that they still have to maintain that kind of relative relationship to natural grade. So
okay,
Thank you.
okay. Can I ask a question along those same lines in terms of the height? And I know that you revised plans in response to Garavalio's report. And so the plans that we have, of course, from December 20th, you sort of pulled back the ridge line a little bit above, at least the section, I guess it's the bedrooms there that are more directly behind the cottage. And that's what's reflected in the elevation that, we all have in the plans.
Yeah, that's right. We previously in the package that was submitted on August 31st.
Right.
Can you hear me? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
The primary residence had a gable roof form over the combined living, dining, kitchen areas, and then that where the overall footprint slimmed up, that continued on as a shed form across it with the same ridge line. In reviewing and taking into consideration Aravalia's feedback, we found it a quite simple move, and actually something that really benefits the project, frankly, to then make a smaller gable, so that bedroom office wing, rather than being the shed form, is now a gable form on that site. So we cut the roof in half of its height behind the cottage. Yeah, and then we also the overhang, the porch overhang, which then becomes part of that covered interior walkway, which we sort of diagrammatically feel like is sort of an extension of the porch. It had been a more flat roof. We've now pitched it in kind of a salt box type form that's similar to what we have on the cottage. So those two are really talking together in a nice way, and that seemed to satisfy that compatibility request that Garavalia had.
Okay, but along those lines, I'm still, and I could see it in the rendering or the elevation, but I wanted to see in the site plan, I don't see the roof line change reflected in the site plan for the revised December drawings. Because it looks like, and I have my magnifying glass, but it looks like that ridge line is still intact and it hasn't been cut back. And I just wanted, maybe this is something that was done, but it wasn't reflected yet in the site plans.
I see it there. Maybe if you want to share the screen, at least maybe we can help navigate that. Share the site plan.
Yeah, it's a 0.5, the site plan.
I'll share that.
Okay.
And I was referring as well to the story pole plans too, just to double check the heights, and that's why I wanted to check with you.
There was an error on the story pole plan that we found when they were putting them up. So just for what it's worth. Okay, you probably cannot see my cursor, but I can. There's a way for me to annotate as you can with other Zoom platform, but that's okay. Okay, so this strip that kind of is over the covered porch, you see horizontal line that looks the slimmest, right? Or a vertical line that looks kind of compartmentalizes that slim part of the roof as it is most adjacent to the cottage.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of that newly tipped salt box look, right?
Yes.
And it tips up into a gable form where the ridge is about at the halfway point of that kind of representative square over the right where the words, it says new residence. Just to the right of that, you see a line that represents the ridge line.
Of the high of the.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, not that one. Go over to the right there. That's the highest point. Now, right where you go, stop. Right, that is the new ridge line. That's the halfway point. From there, it slopes down.
Slopes back down towards the pool.
Slopes down, and then it slopes down towards the pool the other direction.
Okay.
That's sloping down. So that is reflected in the site plan, and there's a line that is perpendicular to that, and it's adjacent. That there's a dimension string of 15'10", and then just to the right of that, you'll see a line that's perpendicular to that main ridge line, and that's showing where the roof cuts down. So I wish I could be pointing.
But it is depicted in the site.
It is depicted
in the roof line. So there you can see it right there if you zoom in. Yeah. So that bedroom wing is now underneath the steeper portion of the roof, which matches more closely the slope of the cottage roof. And it's a gable form as opposed to a shed form. Previously, the ridge line extended all the way north along
right.
that bedroom wing.
And so you pulled it back.
That's right.
Yes, that's correct. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. So yeah, there you go. So, and then the reality is, of course, this is a view as you're walking up the private cul-de-sac. As you sort of, even if you were to stand directly in front of the cottage, you can't even see that bedroom wing. essentially. So it's
Okay.
completely concealed behind the cottage.
Okay. And can you elaborate on the other modifications that you made in response to Garavalia in terms of the windows?
Yeah, sure, of course. In the living room, that sort of is stacked above the garage door. Previously, we had windows that went down to the floor there, but we've now raised them with a sill that is similar in height to the sill of the windows at the east elevation of the cottage.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Does anyone like to throw in some questions or comments?
I think that Stacy Kozakovich had her hand raised.
Oh.
Yeah, the two architectural historians that are in the audience raised their hands when you were talking about moving the structure. So I don't know if you want to hear from them.
Let's get back
Okay.
to that.
All right, I'm going to let Jerry Holon speak first, and then the other historian right after that.
Okay, there we go. Can you hear me, see me?
Yes,
Yeah.
both.
Okay. Yeah, and I wanted to say, I mainly had comments in respect to the relocation, not so much the redesign. And I concur with some of what Mike said. Haven't heard what Paige and Turnbull said, but he's assuming that the cottage is only eligible on the National Register under criterion B, when in fact, this cottage is also eligible for the register under criterion A, which is a pattern of American settlement. So it's an early Californian estate, and also C for its stick style architecture. And I do appreciate Paige and Turnbull's input on the Chevy Chase material style. But in any case, because it is eligible for all three, it does have to maintain its integrity, which includes the location and the setting. And I agree that some of the environment has been degraded. Of course, the horrific loss of the main house and the piano studio. However, I think when you stand on that porch and you look out over Corte Madera Valley and you see the bay beyond and the mountains behind, the power of that setting is still apparent. And I hope that all of you go out and stand on that porch before you vote on relocating it, because I think the Victorian setting is still very apparent, and it's very, very important for this particular project. And I think in my June 23rd report, I had talked about the setting and, what eligibility what it needs to meet the setting. And it's basically the physical environment. The location is the specific place where a property was built, but the setting refers to the character of the place, and it involves the how and not just where. And the way a property is positioned reflects the builder's concept of nature and his aesthetic preferences. Settings can be natural or man-made. And I think that Pixley's vision for that property, this was his first cottage that he built, it's for his wife, it's his honeymoon cottage, picked the most important place on his farm. And that's where the cottage is today. And I think it would be, if, I don't know, can I share screen on here? Yeah, let's see. I just wanted to go back to, let's see here. I'm going to see if I can, I just want to bring up some of the illustrations that we've had before, and then close this out and get this open. Hang on. Screen. Okay, so you don't want me to share my window, Elise? You've stopped the screen sharing?
You're muted, Elise.
Sorry, it should work. Try again.
Oh, okay, try again. All right. All right, share. Okay, we're all here, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, we're getting there now. Okay, photos. So you've got the historic analysis, 1887 photo. And okay, so back to this infamous photograph. This does, I think, and we're not certain, but I do believe that this photo shows the little honeymoon cottage, and I think the single central dormer is the one that's there now. I think in the 1980s and 90s, the porch was expanded to get its current double gable form. But this shows you the kind of the impressive place that the cottage actually occupied. And what the applicant is doing is actually moving it 30 feet to the north, about 38 feet to the east, and about 6 to 8 feet lower than where it is now. You'll still be able to see towards the valley. You probably won't be able to see, you know, the bay beyond. So I think that is, while it seems very slight now in the large scheme of things, I think it's a huge relocation. And I think you will definitely lose the character of the Victorian farm there. And the other thing is that the the CEQA issue is the other thing that's really critical. And I don't know, Elise, if you want to talk about that now, but the CEQA issue, relocation might not violate CEQA conformance, but the relocation would violate compliance with the National Register. So I think if you really relocate this cottage, and the only thing it has is its setting and its finish, that you would lose one primary component, you know, of its character. And going back to what let me see here, somebody else, one of the other panelists, one of the other board members talked about was the grading issue. And I think that's the problem, is that you're lowering the dominant building and you're, you know, raising the new building. And so that just exacerbates, you know, the diminishment of the cottage. So I think you are losing the setting and you are losing the feeling when you locate it. Lastly, I think one other thing I wanted to show you here, let's close this out, was the an Ardmore. Okay, let me get this. How do I make this a bigger screen? Hang on a second. It's not moving. Here we go. The other thing is here's a kind of just a site plan. The other thing is that they are claiming that CEQA allows the relocation of a historic building under certain conditions. And that very well might in fact be true. But one of the conditions is that they study alternative sites. And we have never seen an alternative study on this property of alternative sites. We've only seen the relocation of the cottage. And I think there should be 3 alternates studied. Number 1 is what a project would look like with an addition. Number 2, move the historic important building to the south and move the new house to the north. Because what's happened in the current project is the new program is overwhelming the old historic property, and it should be the opposite. According to the guidelines, the historic property should be the primary focus, the dominant feature of the site. And you shouldn't have to modify it radically to conform to a new program. This project is basically taking the historic building and moving it to conform to the new program. And I think it's backwards. And I think if you did want to study, a third alternative is to move the historic cottage to the north, but keeping it at the same elevation. If you look back, there's the original subdivision plan here basically shows the three structures in their original location when they were destroyed and taken down in 2004. And you can see that each one of those buildings is very sensitively placed into the landscape. They had 160 acres. They could have placed them anywhere. And they placed them right here, the 3 most important buildings. So that cottage is pretty well aligned with its environment, and it still is. You can still see the redwood grove he walked in. You can still see the bay. You can still see the valley. The house was pretty well skewed a little bit to the south. There was probably a better view over there. And the piano studio, I can't talk about that because I just don't have a sense of, it was just in the lower, less important space. So I do believe that the location of this building in particular is super important. And that is my conversation on relocation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so are you going to turn me off, or does anybody have questions?
Okay, I'll bring up the next architectural historian.
Yeah, I'd like to hear Page and Turnbull.
Hi, thanks for promoting me to join in again, and thanks, Jerry, for that insight into possible alternatives for moving the cottage. I think that just from the perspective of the material integrity of the cottage, I think in addition would require removal of so much original historical material that would cause a great deal of other problems with respect to the Secretary of the Interior standards. And so, you know, it's something that I'm aware that the architects had discussed at an earlier point in development of the idea, but I really don't think that that would be an improvement over the current relocation. I think that one of the things that Jerry hinted at, which is really significant in the discussion of understanding, for example, whether if Pixley was walking down Ardmore Road and saw the cottage, whether he would recognize it. This cottage was part of a 191 acre estate. It was not the only building by any stretch of the imagination. The cottage was part of an estate which included multiple other buildings. It included animal enclosures, vineyards, orchards, a coach house, corrals, a main house, which I am not certain that any of the 3 buildings that existed until 2004 was in fact the main Pixley house. I think those were buildings associated with the estate, but not necessarily the main farmhouse. And this building, again, the understanding that this was the honeymoon cottage is not something that we necessarily can base our understanding of the whole estate significance on. It is part of the local lore. But I'll also, quite frankly, this is the last remaining piece of the puzzle that is the Pixley estate. But I think it's important that we don't overstate what the importance of this cottage was at the time the estate was operating. Basically, this is all coming around to saying that I think if Frank Pixley walked down Ardmore Road right now, he wouldn't recognize anything about it, because the cottage has been changed, the setting has been changed, the estate has been subdivided multiple times from its original almost 200 acre span. And so what we're looking at is preserving what the city of Larkspur found significant in this cottage when it was originally understood to be historically significant to the city. And so we have a number of features that are character defining. Whether or not those are original could take hours of discussion, quite frankly. But I think that moving the cottage within the existing parcel, within the context of its larger original estate, and keeping its general orientation and slightly altering the placement on the slope, is not going to diminish the integrity of setting and association and feeling to the degree that the cottage would lose its eligibility for listing in the National or California Register. It is absolutely preferable to not move a historic resource if you can avoid it at all. In this case, I think that a great deal of sensitivity has been brought to the decisions that have been made to recommend relocation to its existing location, or to its proposed location from its existing location. I think we also need to look realistically at what the view is now rather than what the view was in the 1880s. I could share a photo of what what the view is currently from one of those porches. And so predominantly when you're looking out over Ardmore, you can see the neighbors' houses and a lot of vegetation. This isn't a sweeping view of a valley below. And I do not believe that 4 feet is going to substantively change what current occupants of this cottage and neighbors can see from standing on the porch. I think that's as much time as I need to take now. I think that we need to balance our understanding of the historic significance of the cottage with a realistic view of what its importance was at its time and what what can be experienced and perceived of the cottage now. Thanks.
Stacy, do you have other photos from that same vantage point?
I can see if I can scroll through them a little bit. There's some more. That's a few other angles. Oh, I stopped sharing. I'm sorry. I was scrolling through and stopped sharing. My apologies. Okay. Okay, can everybody see here again? Okay, I'll see if I can manage to scroll through this. Okay, so there we are on the porch. And that's a look around, sort of panning from side to side from the porch.
Okay, yeah, that's good. That's probably similar to the view from the front porch that the new structure is going to have, I would guess.
That I can't weigh in on because it's set back a little bit further and it's going to have the cottage in front of it. So that's its view is going to be substantively obscured by the cottage. But the architects are going to be a better source for what the projected view from the cottage will be. Or pardon me, from the new house would be.
Well, thank you for the pictures. I was there on a rainy day and didn't get that view at all.
Yeah, yeah. The other thing that maybe this is a side note is that just getting back to the parking for a moment is there's the cottage is going to be surrounded by a lot of hardscape now. I mean, with the project, if it's built as proposed, whereas it once was kind of a cottage that had a little gate, sort of green field around it, a carport, but it's going to have a wall behind, a house structure behind it, a driveway next to it with a sunken garage and 2-car parking in front of it. So there's going to be a path going up to it. So there's not going to be a lot of, sort of the greenery that you associate with a farm cottage. And that may or may not be an important characteristic, when we're talking about siding and roofing and relocating and all of that. But you just have to think about the whole appearance of the structure.
I understand your point. I think one of the issues with setting and association and feeling, particularly setting and feeling, that we agree with Mike Garavaglia on is that although we see a lot of green currently, we see a landscaped area, this doesn't necessarily represent what would constitute integrity of setting relative to its original. And so
I think it would, though. I mean, given that there was so much acreage around this cottage, it's not like there were carports and garages and structures directly behind it.
Well, and there's carports and garages and structures directly on the other sides of it right now. And so, our kind of view on what is there now on the larger, just kind of on adjacent properties is that the setting has been diminished to an extent that the remaining greenery within that lot isn't sufficient to rescue or to retain the integrity of setting of a kind of rural agricultural environment. You know, there is no way to retain that within one small parcel. The larger ranch setting was diminished, you know, beginning in the first decades of the 20th century with residential subdivision of the area. So I think I appreciate that trying to maintain a more naturalistic setting is going to provide a kind of a picturesque backdrop for the cottage. But just from the kind of more colder analytical view of looking at the setting in the broader scale, I don't believe that any of that can convey a large, almost 200-acre agricultural property. So, you know, some of that is obviously, much of this is obviously subjective,
yeah, I mean,
which is why.
Can we ask Jerry to comment on your points?
I could bring her back up.
If she's willing.
See, I don't know why it's not working. Oh, here she comes.
I'm here. I'm sorry, I lost my mouse. Anyway, thank you, Stacy, for your comments. I do appreciate them. I will say that in regard to overstating the significance of the property, I'm not sure I really agree. The subdivision map that I showed you was from 2004, and those in fact were the main building, the piano studio and the honeymoon cottage. And if Kristen was still here, she was present when those hearings took place and they decided to demolish the original building. So those are the original buildings, and we do have the photographs of them. So I think that even with all the surrounding development, you still have what I call the overall setting, which is the view towards the bay, the mountains, the mountain behind it. The redwood grove is still there, and it's very apparent. I think you still get an agricultural setting. I mean, if as a Victorian farm, you're never going to have a 90-acre site. And the changes that started happening started when Vera Pixley sold the property. But the main buildings, besides the support functional accessory buildings of a farm, the main dwelling units were the main dwelling, the honeymoon cottage. I'm not sure about the piano studio and the, you know, the laundry room or whatever that third building was, which was built later. But I think it did give, and still does, that little location of that little building on that little knoll right there in that one spot where the elevation's flat really is very important. Yes, I agree now that the view is not the same. But if a fire came through there, and that is not unheard of in California these days, and everything burnt down, all the trees, you'd probably have a very similar view of the 1887 photo that we had. I'm only 5 feet tall, but the first time I stood on that porch, I thought, oh my God, it's breathtaking. I didn't even know what the building was. I had no idea who Pixley was, but it's the first thing that you kind of sense on that property. And I think Hillary's comments are well taken too, that there is a lot of hardscaping when I think previously it was a little bit more softscape on the site. And is that, Richard, any other questions that you might have?
No, it's just that. Thanks, Jerry.
Yeah. Thanks, Jerry. Anyone else have any comments or questions that they'd like to address to the wealth of historic knowledge that we have this evening?
Well, I'm wondering, Hillary, are we charged with talking about the compatibility of new building with the cottage relocation, or is that a whole separate issue?
No, that's part of what we need to discuss. Yes, because that is one of the findings that we would have to make tonight, that it meets the Department of the Interior standard. So yes.
Well, that is one thing I felt in looking at it, is that it seems like it overwhelms the cottage. And I'm wondering if there isn't some other kind of adjustments that could be made where the cottage stands out a little bit separate from the new building. In scale, at any rate.
Yeah, I agree. That's how the drawings feel.
May I recommend that you take public comments and then
Yeah,
discuss
you
it?
know what?
Because you have a
I'm fine
number of
with that.
people out
Let's-
there.
Let's take some. Can we do that? Can you facilitate that, Elise?
Sure. If you'd like to speak in the public, and if you're one of the Ellens, there, I don't know that I'll be able to tell you apart when we could call you up. So if you have the opportunity to rename yourself, that would make it easier. But if you'd like to comment, please raise your hand and we can call on you. So I'm going to call on what I believe is James Holmes. I'm glad he was able to join the meeting. Go ahead and speak, Mr. Holmes.
Yes, James Holmes, Larkspur. Thank you to the planning director for giving me the updated call-in information. Unfortunately, I just called in, so I missed the beginning. So if this information is already in evidence, I apologize for asking. But is there any in determining whether? Well, number one, I think the fact that we have a photograph showing the building in its location makes it more valuable to continue it to be in that location because the photograph confirms the historic character. If we didn't have a photograph showing exactly where it was, then perhaps it would be more reasonable to have more flexibility as to the location. But I also wanted to ask you, do we have any evidence regarding whether it is in fact possible to move the building without seriously damaging it? I mean, it seems like a rather informally built structure when I looked at it, and one of its key elements is those two porches projecting out. It's not like it's just a square structure which can be moved easily. It has protuberances of various kinds. So before we could decide whether whether it could be moved, I think there would have to be pretty substantial evidence that it in fact could be moved without it falling apart or without its protruding porches having to be either removed or just falling apart in the course of moving them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other hands raised. I know there were some other people at the beginning that wanted to speak. So if anyone wants to raise your hand, Kirsten Fisher, the project architect, still has her hand raised, but no one else has their hand raised. Oh, now one of the Ellens has their hand raised. I'm going to call on her first. All right, you should be able to speak.
Hi. Can
Hello.
you hear me
We
now?
can hear you. Yes.
Hi, thank you for giving me a moment. I'm just a Larkspur resident of 17 years, and I live in a turn of the century home, and I really value the integrity of vintage architecture. And I'm really impressed by the thoughtfulness that's gone into this design and all the heart and soul and work and the desire to preserve this structure, which has so decayed, is inhabitable and on a piece of land that's really been so significantly altered. I mean, the carports, the driveway of the other properties, it's just not the it's not the land that it was, the 200 acres. It's so significantly altered. So I guess I feel like we should be thrilled that people want to preserve this structure, and I think elevate it, bring it closer to the street and elevate it and give it, bring it back to the glory that it once had, versus just it's been falling apart for about 20 or 30 or 40 years. So I don't know. When we talk about the sweeping land of pics, it's just not that anymore. Sadly, tragically, the other homes have been torn down. This is the last one, and we have somebody who wants to honor it. So, and it's taken years to really be thoughtful about the best way to do it. So that's what I want to say, as somebody who cares about Larkspur and its history.
Can we know who's speaking?
Victoria Love.
Thank you.
Okay, there's no other hands raised unless someone wants to speak. Oh, here's another one. Steve O'Shea, I'm gonna give you permission to speak. You should be able to unmute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name's Steve O'Shea. I'm from Larkspur, actually. I've lived here about 40 years. So I'm a neighbor actually here of the property. So I'm well acquainted with the buildings that were torn down and the history of the area. My feeling is that, to me, the new development seems like trying to cram a lot into a small lot, I guess is what it feels like to me. To me, it'll adversely affect the aesthetic of the neighborhood. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say.
Thank you. If anyone else would like to speak, would you raise your hand? Any members of the public? I still don't see any hands raised. Would you like to hear from the applicant one more time?
Sure, we're happy to hear from whoever would like to chime in.
Okay.
Just a couple of things. Going back with respect to the view and the change in the view from the porch. I'll direct you to sheet A 0.3 in our drawing packet. If you wouldn't mind having a look at that, please.
Is this in the original plans?
That's right, on August
yeah.
31st. The December plans were just those selected sheets where we changed the roof, but
Okay.
I'll pull those up.
thanks.
A 0.3.
Mhm.
Okay, got it.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just note that we did a very careful using ladders and little scaffold to mock up where you would be standing right at kind of the front door of the cottage. I'm looking over my shoulder at my drawing. It's there. You know, in the proposed location versus the where it presently is on site. And these are, this is the comparative view today versus what you would see if the cottage were moved. And that is absolutely, you know, at the right elevation level, measured against measured against grade, average person eye height. So I'll just note that's one piece that I wanted to point out when Stacy was pulling up photographs. We had done this comparison as part of the packet. And, you know, just for what it's worth, there's been talk about the overall size of the original historic Pixley estate. I'm not one of the historians on the project, but I will note that we did help assist with trying to put the estate in its historical context, in what overlays now in Larkspur today, and where and how the current cottage sits in that versus where we want to relocate it. So that's all there on that sheet. You have to get it nice and close, because that one, if you scroll up a little bit, Elise, on the map, the one that looks more like a modern Google map, you can see, there you go. There you can see the red is where the cottage presently is, and the blue is where we're proposing to move it in the context of the overall historic Pixley estate. I think that that's where maybe, and again, you know, the historians have all kind of stated their point on that, but I think that's what they were trying to describe when whether or not they would consider it a significant move or not. Because if you were just looking at the parcel as it is today, maybe you could say that. If you're looking at the historic Pixley estate, it's I think it tries to illustrate that it's a pretty small shift in that respect. There was a question then about moving the cottage from the caller, the person on the phone. What might happen if the cottage were moved? Might it fall apart? I know that there's been other questions about this at previous hearings in Larkspur, and it's pretty an established principle of how you move a cottage or how you move a historic building. It's pretty, I think it's a pretty, I understand it's a very safe thing to do. I'll just note that the entirety of the porch as it is right now, 100%, you can crawl underneath there. And the posts that support all of the porch now are all pressure treated material. So if those fall apart a little bit, when we move it, we're going to put it back with better material. I don't think pressure treated was a historic material. I think that was added or repaired at some point. And we've already, I think it's been established that that those two pop-out gables are not part of the original period of significance. So that's kind of a separate question. But what we can tell you is that those were rebuilt at some point, as was the entire porch on that east side. It's all pressure treated material and modern plywood. So I think we look to not restore the pressure treated, but to restore it with materials or refurbish it, rehabilitate it with materials that are more historically accurate.
Moving the cottage is one of the easier aspects of this project. I mean, the physical moving of it anyway. So I feel very confident that we know how to do that.
Would it be helpful for you, for the board members, if we were to give you better evidence of our thought process and maybe some timeline background and some other alternative ways that we could develop the site so that you can make a better informed decision? I mean, we've talked theoretically about like what it would look like to put a 2-story house or an addition, how much of the historic cottage we would have to tear off in order to attach an addition to it, and what that might look like. You know, and where the parking might go, and how we might locate a covered parking area that might obscure the cottage. You know, we can go into that. We can talk with Ellen and Steve about doing an exploration of that. We need to again re-engage the neighbors, and they've already described to us that they prefer not having a 2-story building there, that the single-story addition or new residence is their preference. So we need to go back to them and discuss, what it might look, how it would impact their views, especially, the folks up the hill, to have a 2-story building there. We could do those things if you'd like to continue this.
Kirsten, I would ask, Jerry mentioned that no alternatives were studied. Do you have anything you can show us as alternatives?
Not at our fingertips, not right now. We'd have to go back into the, our initial sketching but.
I think we also need to illustrate where those kind of led to dead ends and kind of had issues of their own, again, that I think if we had come forth with one of those proposals, we'd most probably be talking about the same thing here. We're just talking about it in different detail. So I really, again, I think it is a difficult site. The buildings, we spoke about overdeveloping it or cramming too much on here. It's a very modest size home, it's just over 2,000 square feet, and we're even kind of having rooms serve multi-purposes here. We're combining rooms so we don't have the kind of sprawling wasted space of circulation. So this is a really efficient building on the site. It's low. We have the neighbors that we worked with very closely initially to make sure that their kind of privacy and the impact to them, which is very real, because again, we're on a private cul-de-sac there. We made sure that they were comfortable with it and worked very hard to look at it that way. But when you start factoring all these things in, parking, 2-story structures, the grade, the prominence of the cottage.
Yeah.
We'll just note too that the zoning ordinance doesn't necessarily require that you include the square footage of an ADU in a development project. I think we're all aware of the ADU laws and how they changed and how you can include ADUs on your property and not include that square footage in your overall count. We have included it. It is a part of our overall square footage, so that we have what we present to you as our overall square footage includes both the cottage and the proposed residence. And we are still under what is allowable by the zoning ordinance. So we have given it to you in the context of it being a complete house as opposed to two structures, but we are keeping them as distinct structures, and the owners would intend to use the cottage as a discrete structure.
And speaking of zoning, the variance or the cottage, the northeast wall of the cottage, it looks like that's kind of into the setback.
No, there's two lines there. There's an easement line, which you're seeing that it looks like and then there's the setback line. So it's the roof overhang is allowed to hang over the easement or the setback line, but the side of the building is aligned with the setback line. That secondary line, which is actually closer to the property line, is demarcating an easement. So it does follow the setback line.
Okay, so the roof is over the setback, but that's allowed.
That's allowed. That's right.
And the setback is, I have to get my magnifying glass, but what is it, like 6 feet from the neighbor's property line?
Yeah. Yeah.
Whereas prior to that, the cottage was like 26 feet away from the property line. So, but that's, that I think I'm bordering on planning commission discussion here, but.
And you bring up a point too about when you mentioned the space around it. We're balancing the desire for vegetation and new trees and preserving existing vegetation with the fire marshal's ordinance. You'll note on the site plan that we have this 5-foot defensible space all around all the building. And that is required by the fire marshal. In fact, the property as it exists now, Ellen and Steve have gotten a number of kind of red tags, as they're not living there and nobody's living there because it's uninhabitable for the vegetation getting to a certain point of being too lush. I think that it's a new reality that we all are facing in California, that we just can't have all of the vegetation that we have enjoyed around our houses. We live in Berkeley, and the fire marshal comes around in Berkeley and charges people $500 for not having tree branches moved back from their homes. So, I think we'd like to see more vegetation on the site. There's plenty of ground cover and low plantings, and that's all planned for in our eventual landscape plan. But that canopy, that lovely forested canopy that we all admire, we have to be careful about that. And it is actually, we're mandated to do it. We can't put forward a design that shows a lot of encroachment of vegetation into the building.
Hillary, when you were discussing about moving the cottage further to the neighbor, I think that's the neighbor who submitted the letter supporting the project. Today we received a couple letters.
Yeah, this afternoon.
I think that neighbor is actually one who submitted supporting it, just so we're aware.
Was that, wait a minute, so this is the neighbor who is like in between 7 Ardmore and the main Ardmore Street, right? That I don't think that was the same neighbor.
Yeah, I think that was 11 Ardmore is the neighbor that's closest to the cottage.
I think it was a different person.
It does appear that they're building a second unit, they're converting their garage into a second unit. And also to correct it, there was some discussion about the setback. I believe the setback is 5 feet from that property line. The state law does require us to allow a 4-foot setback for a second unit.
Oh.
A 4-foot for a second unit.
Right. And they're doing 5 because there's actually an easement there too that they can't build over.
So that's a new ADU laws?
Well, it's been a couple years now, but 4 feet is the maximum the city can require.
Yeah, and the old ADU was limited of 700 square feet, and now that's changed now, right? That's you have
Right,
more.
850 to 1,200 square feet.
Wow. Wow.
No, with no required parking. There's no required parking for ADUs either.
Interesting. Okay.
One of the letters I think we got was from 79 Ardmore. I don't know if that,
And that's the uphill neighbor. So the
Yeah,
one with the
uphill.
construction site right immediately behind the.
Right.
Yeah.
Which was part of the same parcel, right? Those two were subdivided.
I don't believe, well, it was all part of Pixley's residence, but the 2000
Right.
subdivision created the 3 lots that are in this cul-de-sac.
But
Okay.
I think when 79 Ardmore purchased their property, they had the opportunity to purchase the other lot and chose
Oh,
not.
they might have been, okay, like they might have been 2
Right.
lots that were sold together. Or
They chose not to. Yeah.
They were part of the same estate. Okay.
Mhm.
All right. Is there anyone else in the public that would like to just throw in their feelings or comments?
I don't see any hands raised.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we're approaching the time when we talk amongst ourselves. Right, Elise, is this?
Yes, that would be, yes. Yeah,
I
you could
think
close the public comment period and
Okay.
bring this back for deliberation.
Yeah. All right. So let's do that. And let's see, I guess I have, for myself, I just want to clarify what would happen with this property if it were approved for the project to go forward. It seems hard to imagine that it would still be an A-rated part of the inventory, given that its main value would be the association with Pixley, because the cottage is going to be moved or relocated, the site is going to be developed. The discussion remains, of course, about the siding and the roofing materials and the lattice work, et cetera. But I just a general question, Elise, is
So the peer reviewer architect indicates that it would still qualify, that it would meet the Secretary of Interior standards. So it would still qualify for listing as a locally historic structure. And in fact, even if it didn't meet the local register, well, I guess it depends on the city's criteria for listing, but one can, or any city could declare a structure locally historic when you're looking at structures for CEQA analysis, but the city has this formal list, and it's, again, depending on which view you look at. We have 2 historical consultants that are saying it would still meet the Secretary of Interior standards and could still be listed as a locally historic structure. And then one historian that believes locating it damages this historical significance so much that it should be removed from the list.
and so what would the long-term benefits or negative side if it remained on the historic, or the potential of being on the National Historic Register? I mean, of course, we could keep it on the Larkspur, but if it were on the National Historic Register, would there be a benefit to Larkspur to keep it on it, or what do you foresee being the future of this property?
That might be a better question for the architectural historians. I mean, you generally listing is more of a, unless one's getting some type of grants or financial assistance, listing is usually something that is restrictive of a property, or again, because it's trying to protect it. So in many respects, it wouldn't change because you're protecting it today. So
Right.
all the structures that you have, you require it to go through review. Any structure that requires, that's altering a structure that's listed on your register needs to go through special review. So, which wasn't the case in the past when those other buildings were demolished. So I guess it doesn't really change.
Okay.
It doesn't
So
need to
in-
be, it doesn't need to be listed in the federal state register to be protected by
Okay.
Larkspur.
Okay, so theoretically, in the future, if the Houghton Lloyd owners said, well, we want to add, skylights or some other modification to the cottage, they would still, if it were still on our inventory, they would still have to come back to the board if they had wanted to make further changes to it.
Correct.
Okay.
At least they're used in the beginning of this whole historic register for Larkspur, there used to be some financial benefits for people. Do you know much about that, if that still exists or?
So we still have a Mills Act program, and we did have someone who inquired about it very recently. So I'll be bringing that item to the commission probably for a first comment. You considered it, I don't think too long ago, maybe 2014 was the last time that someone had requested a Mills Act contract. And what essentially that means is that their property taxes are reduced. And I think the city's limit is about $15,000. And then that $15,000 is set aside for property maintenance and repairs. And I think the contract length is 10 years. So, and that's a significant financial incentive for doing things to protect a structure. So it's not gone. The city just hasn't entered into any contracts lately. And the city council, if your last recommendation was open up the program again, of course, that I would assume that would be your recommendation. So it's primarily, I think, a financial consideration of the city council because they'd be losing tax revenue as well as any other agencies that are depending on the city's tax revenue, like the schools. So it's certainly something that we could bring back to the city council to ask if they will consider opening up that program again.
I think from what I understand, that's the cause, that's the reason why this program was terminated years ago by city council, that it's a loss of revenue.
Yeah, I didn't know if it existed at some level still. I just hadn't heard about it for so long.
And I'm sure there's grants
level.
available for specific projects, but I don't know enough about those to let you know about them.
Yeah, no, just. Thank you.
So, should we have some more, maybe go around and have each of us give sort of a summation or your thought process where you stand at this point? Carol, let's start with you.
Is that public comments that we're having right now? Or is that something we should be discussing as a committee?
We're discussing among the board now, I believe, huh?
Yeah, just among the board.
Is the public on?
No, I think it's still a public meeting,
I
isn't
think
it?
we still have a public
meeting. Yeah,
the public
will hear what
still
we
here.
say.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, you want to know how I'm feeling?
Yeah, let's start with
I
you.
can tell you. It goes back to my first question I asked earlier. If we don't do this, what happens to that lovely little historic piece of property? And I would rather see it preserved in some form. And so I would support moving it sensitively. I'm a little bit concerned about the mass of the new house still in relation to the cottage, but that's my position.
How about you, Sonia?
I agree a lot with what Carol just discussed. I think I keep sort of circling back in my mind to Jerry's comments about the location and the significance of the spot. And even if you take Pixley out of it altogether, he never is going to come back to Larkspur. The significance of the cottage on the site? And if you move it, do you lose historic significance so that in the future, another owner, another application to do something, it's been degraded and it will just sort of have that slippery slope to just becoming something else entirely. But I also hear Carol's point about, sort of the compromise and doing the best you can to preserve as much as you can. And just because so much of the plot of land that we're talking about, or that whole Ardmore cul-de-sac, is so transformed from what it was, does that mean we just like sort of throw it all out? That, I mean, then what's the point of having us at all for any of Larkspur buildings? That's really confused. I'm really confused. So I feel like I'm still like weighing all of these. But I do come back to that location being, potentially a big, is it a big deal? Like, I'm really thinking hard about that.
I
Rich,
have
how
to
about
say,
you?
I agree with Sonia's comment about the fact that it's been compromised over the years is a sad thing, and you'll never get it back. On the other hand, I do think the relocation as it's been done, as it's being shown, and the lowering of the elevation both diminish the historic value of the property. And I'm not sure that there's not a better way to solve this. I think I agree too that the new building, even though it's only 2,000 square feet, does overwhelm the site. It is not a compatible structure in scale as I can see it. And the fact that no alternatives apparently were looked into, even though I'm sure the thinking process was you eliminate, you have dead ends, you things that you just have to just say just don't won't work, but we don't see that. We don't see alternative solutions.
Let's see, I guess I'm next. I have very mixed feelings about, I certainly want the cottage to be preserved. And it seems like the alternative is that it would be totally overwhelmed by being incorporated into some of these big homes, or it would be destroyed or demolished. And so I'm glad to see there's this proposal to find a use for it, even though it's not the ideal setting. I'd rather have it in its old setting and the other house built behind it, but I gather that none of the neighbors want a two-story house and that this is how the resolution came about. But I am glad that there's some proposal to preserve it.
Yeah. It's a bit of a numbers game. Given that a percentage of the new house is, what is it, below 7 feet, or 50% of it's below grade. I forget what the math is. But it's basically taken a 3,350 foot house and made it a 2,330. So like you've chopped off 1,000 square feet of the number, but you still have that garage door, and you still have basically, almost a two-story house, but part of it sunken in the ground, 475 cubic yards of dirt being moved. So it is a massive structure that's very new and modern, and that's going there behind the cottage. And that being said, it doesn't have to replicate the cottage. It doesn't have to look like an extension of the cottage. It's okay to have something that is compatible and respectful of the cottage. I think they've made adjustments to the roof line and the windows, but I haven't seen much else in the way of trying to, I don't know, like shrink it. But this is the time that we live, you know, that there's more needs for houses and more modern houses. And I'm glad that the cottage is going to be preserved and still very visible. The view of the cottage and from the cottage is going to be altered. There's no getting around that. And I think it would, you know, things can't stay the same. And I'm glad that we've had a chance to weigh in on these plans, and I'm just going through the whole pile of paperwork and just looking at the iterations and the changes and the conversations back and forth. And I appreciate the time that the owners have put into trying to meet the standards of our community, because they are very important. The preservation of Larkspur's character that everybody loves so much begins with maintaining these properties as best as we can. So I'm not smart enough to think of another solution for this cottage. I think it would ultimately be developed, but I don't know if there's anything else that could be done other than moving it and maybe doing another addition on the side. But I think there still would be issues, even if we move the cottage or built something to the side. I think no matter where we go, there's going to be, you know, issues. So I'm sorry I'm rambling. Does anybody else want to chime in with more thoughts here before we start like pinning it down a little bit? Because I think we probably, unless we want to move for continuance on this, but I mean, personally, I would like to get this resolved, because we've been sitting with this project for a long time. It's been rumored in the community. I mean, newspaper articles. I would like to move this along, and it might be time to put it toward a motion. And if there's any modifications that we need to make, because we've got 5 different determinations that we have to make as a board tonight. If you guys, it's page 4.
I know it
Yeah,
might,
we're just
it might
looking
be
for the-
good to start with the movement one, because that's such a critical part of this the program for this project. So if there was consensus on allowing it to be moved or not, that would be probably a good place to start.
Okay, so let me go over our choices again. Let's see. Okay.
Is it page 4 and the bolded part there where we must make following standards?
Yeah, but before we get to that, we have to come up with a movement, an action. I don't have it's been such a long time since I've had to do this.
So is it a motion?
Okay. All right, so we have to make let's see, the options. Elise, can you help me here in terms of how we?
Oh, in terms
structure
of like at the end, maybe at the end of my report, are you thinking in terms of, let's go here,
the course of action?
like project approval versus doing something else?
Yeah,
Or-
here it is. The board actions, I found it. So we have 4 choices. We can, if we find that the standards have been satisfied, we can recommend that the application is approved. That's number 1. Number 2 is if the standards can be satisfied with conditions, we can recommend that the application is approved with the conditions. So we can think about that. Number 3, we can continue the application to allow the applicant the opportunity to modify the proposal to satisfy the standards. And number 4 is if they cannot be met, we recommend that the application be denied. All right. So I don't know that personally that I want to deny this application outright. There may be conditions that we want to discuss as a board. If there's anything that we feel that we want to, request or require that this project follows, we can talk about that.
Well, I feel like we're all concerned about the mass of the new house, but I'm not sure how we can really make that a condition.
Right. Without continuing this process.
Although I'm curious, Elise, after us, it still goes before planning, correct?
Right.
And I assume, will they look at those things like the mass of that new house?
I mean, they're going to look at the mass of the house. Yeah, I mean, they have to look at the mass of the house, and they have to consider, because that's, again, the mass of the house relates to whether or not they can make the, whether or not it complies with Secretary of Interior standards. But they'll look at it generally because of design review as well. So if you had a concern, you could make that, you could make it as a recommendation that's general and not have it come back to you. But I think it might be, oh yeah, so it would be saying the standards would be satisfied with conditions that you're recommending. That would be one way to do it.
But how would we recommend, how would we come up with conditions related to mass?
Well, I mean, if it was something really general, like it's acceptable if they reduce the mass of the house. You may want to see that design to make sure that they've actually complied. Or if you're leaving that up to the planning commission, it's just that you think it's acceptable, but you think the mass of the house should be reduced, and leave it up to the planning commission to make that determination.
I think that is a reasonable condition. That the mass of the house be reduced.
Yeah, I agree. It's incompatible with the cottage.
Those, I feel like those are two different things, like the compatibility of the versus the mass, because something could be compatible but just as big. Maybe it's the different. It could be the style of it too. I mean, something that one of the architects mentioned is the idea of like preserving the historic character. It's the historic part of the space that should be prominent, not the new part. In this case, just the images that we have, it makes the new house look, even though it's behind the cottage, it looks so bulky, prominent. I mean, we're all using these words, the mass, but it could just be like their stylistic preference.
Well, if we relate it to the Department of Interior standards, I think what we're referring to is standard number 2 and standard number 9. Number 2, which is the character that talks about the spatial relationship, and number 10 talks about related new construction and spatial relationships, and massing, proportion and massing. So the new house just kind of expands from one end of the lot to the other, and the cottage is being sort of pushed to one side.
So where are you reading those standards?
It's in Jerry's.
I got them out of Page and Turnbull's very first draft, May 5th.
Oh, all right, thank you.
It's the standard. It's the standard language.
Yeah,
it's page 26 of that report.
Okay, I'm thumbing through so many papers.
I know.
It's also in Jerry's report too, from June 23rd. That helps.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's under.
And a lot of it is just
Well.
interpretation, to be honest. At this point, I think.
All right. Well, it sounds like we're not ready to approve the project as proposed. But we need to be more specific.
Well, I don't know if it's helpful. I mean, it doesn't sound like we can break it into pieces, but it seems like if we can at least say whether we can support the relocation, that will give them some ability to perhaps go back and work on the new house. But it seems like there's two pieces. There's relocation and the new house. So maybe can we break it into two pieces?
Well, that makes sense because relocating it allows them to do much more with their property, which seems pretty reasonable to me.
At least it lets them know, you know, that's been a big unknown, whether we would agree to that or not.
Yes. I'm okay with the relocation of the cottage.
Me too.
If we break it up that way. But I don't know. I mean, I've sort of, I might be contrarian here, but I feel that this house, this proposed house, it looks like it's big on paper, but it might not be as dominating as we're thinking that it might be. You know, sometimes.
Yeah, the rendering. I'm wondering about the rendering too.
Yeah, I mean, it might be okay. I don't know, having gone through a couple of remodel projects myself and just seeing how like intense it is when you see the stuff on paper and you're looking at the but I don't know, I'm not an architect. I'm just someone who's lived in the community a long, long time, and I've seen a lot of projects, and I don't know. I sort of think that it might not be so bad. Maybe that's heresy.
Well, I
for
was
a board
thinking maybe
member.
some landscaping of big trees or shrubs around it to shelter the one from the other might make a difference too. Might make it feel like it was more like the old setting.
But we can't look at plants as a way to.
No,
because like somebody said, if there were a fire, you know, we'd have the, you know, the buildings still left.
Right.
Or if whoever lives there, you know,
Right.
50 years from now, it could be a totally different family that's living there. I mean, we have to look at what's going to be built.
The new rendering is kind of a two-dimensional rendering. And when you go back and look at the original plans, they've got a more three-dimensional proposed rendering. And it gives you a little better feel for how it would look versus looking at the two-dimensional. So it's AO.2 in the original package.
Oh, I see it. It does, but you know, this top one, this one right here.
Yes.
Makes it a little more bulky, actually. The bottom one, not so much. When you look at the cottage from the corner of, you know, the gate at the entrance to Owlswood, when you look back at the cottage from that perspective, it actually looks fine because the new house is kind of tucked behind it. But if you go deeper into the cul-de-sac and you're looking, I mean, of course, you know, you're looking at the modern structure here, it almost looks like, I mean, it doesn't even look like a residence almost. It's very.
My daughter thought it looked like a school.
Well,
It
I
does
was
look a
thinking it
little like
looks
a
school-like too. From that view.
Yeah.
I guess that shows what renderings do. I mean, that's the
Yeah.
hard part, right? We're trying to envision something and it's very difficult to do.
And it might be softened with the cedar finish that they're talking about using the batten, the board and batten.
Mhm.
You know, I'm just talking about the new structure.
Mhm.
You know, because wood has a way of kind of like taking, you know, pulling a mass back.
Yep.
You know, though, I think that there's really no way around it to get the size, you know, home that the size that they would like. It's going to overwhelm. It's going to be more prominent, no matter where they put it. It's going to be more
Right.
prominent than the small historic cottage. So
Yeah.
I guess really at the end of the day is because we live in the world that we live in, and this is, you know, are we serving future Larkspur well by approving this project and having, you know, this small cul-de-sac be sort of further developed and more, you know, that ever more loss of the character that it has in that sort of like small wooded area with the smaller, you know, little cottage on it? Or are we serving Larkspur well by just, you know, preserving that small cottage in whatever form we can, to the loss of both that original location. And that spoke to me because I think my house sits on a property that there were originally 3 structures on it that were divided into 3 parcels. And, you know, fortunately, all 3 are still standing. And from my neighbors' homes and decks and from our own, the relationship between them and the relationship to the landscape is very meaningful and powerful to us who live with it very intimately. So that really did speak to me, and how, you know, Jerry mentioned it. And I think that it is a loss. It is a degradation to the historic significance to have it moved. So is it the building itself? I mean, if we lost the building altogether, if it just falls apart over the next decade, sorry, now I'm the one rambling, Hillary, but this is
no, go for it.
right. Like it was helpful when you were talking it out. So maybe, you know, what is the least amount of loss? And our charge here is to help preserve that, the character and heritage, right? That, I mean, we can all see if we walked downtown, see the screen behind Elise, the picture behind Elise, and there's such clear like reasons and what we would value and keep there. What now when we get into the neighborhoods, it gets a little bit, it's more gray, right? It's more muddy. Like what preserves that, what we think of as the character and charm of Larkspur? Is it, you know, part of it is that, you know, so many homes are individual and unique, right? So this is going to add to that. There will be, it's evolving. There's a new, you know, carefully designed home for a particular family that will become part of the fabric. So maybe that's, you know, that's the way it's going to go. But, you know, all of us here are the historic lovers, and it's always sad to see a piece of that fabric overlaid, I guess, or taken it, you know, there's always loss with progress. There's always the loss.
Yeah.
But at
Rich,
least
what do you think?
Pardon me?
Rich, what do you think?
Well, you know, there's one other issue that we haven't talked about, and that's the style of the house, as Jerry had said during its important period, was a stick style as chosen by the owners. Yes, there's a previous version of it. We can see that, but I think that's something that would add to the character of this building to restore that style. I'm thinking that we might want to consider continuing this and ask the applicants to look at reducing the mass of the new building you know, between the fact that it is, you call it only a 2,000 square foot building, but what is it? It's actually plus the ADU space. There's a lot of living space on this, in this proposal.
Yeah.
Is that under our purview to ask that, or is that a planning commission issue?
No, we can continue.
I mean,
Or the mess, to reduce the mess?
Yes.
Yes. I mean, because you're, yeah, that's one of the specified options you
Okay.
have is to continue it, to ask
All
for
right.
modification.
I think it would be nice if we, I don't know, do we have a consensus on Elise allowing it to be moved? Is there a consensus here? I don't know. I'm not.
I feel like
clear.
I'm hearing it now that there is.
Because if there is a
and that is,
consensus, it seems like that would give them a lot of ability to do some additional work. Without that consensus, they're kind of going back to the drawing board, not knowing what we're going to say or do if they come back with something.
I mean, I would offer, you might want to see if they would like to say if they've heard, if they have ideas for coming back to you with something, because I know they wanted to first give options for other ideas, other locations where they considered building, but maybe they're willing to return with a revised design for the massing. Would you, oh, they've got the
does seem
architects.
like
Let's see, do you want to hear from the applicant?
There are two issues. One is the moving and the other is the compatibility with the new design.
Yeah.
It's like one
Spatial
depends on the
relationship.
other.
Do you want to hear from the architects? They have their hands raised.
Sure.
Sure.
Oh, sure.
Oh, hopefully it's working.
So I think there's been a lot of good points here. I think one of the board members hit the nail on the head. I think that giving us at least the leeway or understanding that we have the ability to move the cottage, so it isn't just this completely open-ended thing, you know, that we don't know. We're looking for the direction, you know, we've been looking for that and trying to find consensus since we started this project. I think that understanding in the nuance of mass, right? How much are you displacing, right? You know, and how do you displace that, right? It's a volume. And if you have the same amount of need and square footage, you can't just kind of compress that. You got to kind of move it or stack it or shift it or whatever that might be. And I do think it's a nuance. And I don't, you know, maybe if I could make a recommendation that if we do continue this with the understanding that we would kind of have the leeway to move the cottage, I would like to meet on the site just so I can
With
you guys, if that's possible, just to really evaluate the hard work that's gone into putting these and accuracy that's gone into putting these story poles up. Exactly what it is you see. And I think that it would be beneficial if one or both of us are there to help kind of explain that. I got excited when one of you was talking about, well, you know, and these renderings can be helpful and that they can also maybe have a counter effect as well. I've been doing this a long time. I know in my heart that you know, that it's not that the building is well sited. Its massing is correct. I have a hard time seeing another alternative to that, but I do think that you know, maybe going on the site and just really kind of exploring what you see, where you see it from, that one view that, you know, you point to up the hill, up the cul-de-sac was to the benefit of the neighbors, you know, because that's really their view of the cottage. It's
Or
not
of
that-
the new house, the
Sorry, the-
secondary rendering that you pointed to in the older set. The one where what you said, it reminded your kid of a school. We made that rendering specifically for a neighbor from that vantage point. So just to put it in that context, that's what we were trying to illustrate at that time.
And we kind of went back and did a second rendering. We kind of moved it down, and that was really to respond to Garavaglia's kind of comments about the roof line and the
Right.
proximity of the
Yeah,
cottage.
so that last rendering that's, standing right in front of the garage looking at, was a quicker exercise done, in the, right before everybody kind of went away for the holidays. Of course, those, more watercolor renderings take a lot of time and energy to produce. So we didn't want to take a lot of time to make that. We did a quicker version with a more simplistic software. But we've actually thought it was pretty helpful view to show how that we really wanted to illustrate our roof changes, and that was the best way to illustrate it.
Yeah. It just occurred to me as I'm looking at this, the cul-de-sac view, we'll call it, the one that you did for the neighbor, sort of looking to the north, the
Yep.
school view. I think part of the issue maybe that I might be having is that it's that sort of straight flat wall. And I know you compromised to put a gable on the northeast side. You have the sort of salt box roof, and then you have a gable on the other side, but it's just a rectangle on this west side, this wall. And that doesn't really look very compatible. Yeah, that's the wall. And to me, that doesn't look as compatible to the cottage as, say, the opposite side of the new house looks. This just looks like kind of almost like a container, like
That's the schoolhouse.
yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, the building is shaped from reason and, analysis. And, that's, I think we could do something like that, without, it doesn't solve some of the issues about getting light into the building and privacy with the neighbor whose house is right there.
And that neighbor just built a new garage right there.
That's
we're
right.
trying to,
So
provide, we've had it illustrated as a carport there. But
now there's a new building there.
That's right.
I think that is, so it's not arbitrary. It's a response to the setting and needs. This is not a building you impose your will, or a site you impose your will on. This is a site that you need to work with, and there's reasons for everything that we've done here. Now, it's not to say there aren't other reasons that you would actually theoretically be a little bit more arbitrary, just to make the rendering look better. But maybe if we go out there and look at it on site and kind of look at the streamlines, look at what we're responding to, I think it'll become a lot clearer, And if at that point it still doesn't make any sense, or there's just, I think we can. I'd like to just give it its kind of due, because I'm not trying to be stubborn about it. I just
No, and neither are we.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and but I do think there's a little bit of misunderstanding about perhaps the reasons why we're doing some certain things, and the vantage point of how you see the buildings in reality, and what. So I'd love that.
Part of our charge here is, we look at what's seen from the street, and this cottage is pretty exposed, right? Because it's on a cul-de-sac, it's not on a straight street. So you do have this western view of the site. So we have to look at how that, it's not just this vantage point, or the Owlswood vantage point. We have to look at from to the west of the cottage and how that looks.
That is a private drive, so that's not, that part, is private.
That's a good point. Okay.
So that is specifically why our one rendering is taken from the closest place on the public right of way where you can look down this private drive to see the cottage and its cottage forward.
That's a good point.
Compared the other rendering specifically for the cul-de-sac neighbor.
Yeah.
So there's a pair of gates there that may or may not be historical. We don't know. They probably are, but they're right there at the kind of end of that private drive, where the private drive meets Ardmore Road, and that's where you can see that in one rendering, and that's where we took it from. So the revised rendering that we did just of the roof changes, again, that is from the private cul-de-sac. You would not even see the new house from the public right of way. And another thought on that, we located a couple of specimen trees in that kind of front yard setback area, still honoring the 5-foot defensible space requirement, but that worked to even more so obscure the new residents from the public right of way. So I think we have a rendering in the August 31st set that from the public right of way where you can't see the new house at all because there's a tree.
It's this one.
And we do we put the tree there or not? Well, the tree is part of the project, so we need to put it there, but it does do what it's intended to do, which is totally obscure the new house from the public right of way, but totally putting the cottage forward for public view.
Yep, it's very evident when you go out there and see the story poles. What is the dominant form on that site? And it's clearly a cottage, no question about it. So from the public's perspective, the public right.
Yeah. That's a very good point about, and I almost think that legally, dare I say, we probably can't think of it. I mean, I think of it as because that's where people walk, and that's, there's cars that drive up there all the time and turn around, and it's access. People go in there. But I don't know if that's part of our purview to look at it from the viewpoint of further down that road. I don't know, Elise, maybe the city attorney could speak to that, but.
I mean, from design review perspective, the planning commission certainly would be able to look at that because they're looking at impacts on everyone. But from a historical resource perspective, I suppose those neighbors also have a view of the historic resource and experience it also, but usually it is, or it seems like them looking at it or considering what the public sees is important.
Okay. But I'm just thinking, I don't know, maybe I'm overthinking.
Well, also the other thing I wanted to mention was the architectural historian, the third architectural historian, did make recommendations to modify the entrance to that structure. The cottage and the structure, I believe. Is that correct, Fishers? It was both with the entry to both the structures?
Not the entry to the cottage, it was the stair, the access stair to the cottage, asking if we could kind of separate that from the garage.
Okay.
Excavation.
Make it more of a landscape stair.
They said that what I read from their document was that while they made the findings for the position of the building, if there was, anything that could be done to kind of lessen, to create a little more buffer at the entry to the new house in its position to the cottage, we could look at that. Again, like that sounds like such an easy thing to say, but I'm not sure how you do that without moving the building and asking for new encroachments into setbacks and things like that. We've kind of wedged things in there on this irregular site, and we're touching setbacks. And again, we were on the site with the story poles, and it felt good to us.
So there are other parts of the project that needed to be modified to comply with the Secretary of Interior standards, like the porch railing and the girding of the residence. So one option would be to continue it to let them address all these changes. So you see a project that's getting a complete recommendation from at least the peer reviewer that it complies with all the standards. Or if you if you think there's any sort of conditions you could make and pass it along to the planning commission. But at some point before it goes to the planning commission, we'll need to have plans that address all those design revisions. It wouldn't go forward to the planning commission with still with things that are questionable about the Secretary of Interior standards. So I guess what I'm suggesting is you might want to continue it just to see more refined plans that deal with those other issues and the entry stairs. And then you have an opportunity to go visit the site again and see the story poles.
You know, it would be helpful because we're really seeing a finished work here, and I keep wanting to think about what other alternatives were looked at and how could we see that and be able to agree with you to rule them out, that they're not compatible, they don't work. But a 3D study model of this scheme too would be useful. And I don't know if you do that, but that's something that would help us understand the massing. And, you know, the comment that you can't condense this and reduce the mass without reducing the square footage, the living square footage of the room. That's right. That's really what that amounts to. It could be that the square footage, the living area of this development is not compatible with the site and that historic building.
You'd have to go to that extent. You got to make the building smaller. You know, that's
what I'm saying. Exactly.
Like give up a bedroom or something. Make it a 2-bedroom house instead of a 3-bedroom house.
But then you have a cottage, you have an ADU.
Then we have an ADU.
Yeah, but I would also look at what is the impact, what does that actually mean to the public or Larkspur by, let's just say you lop off that entire bedroom wing behind the cottage. Like, that's a kind of something that isn't even perceived anywhere other than on this property, you know. So it's a huge impact to our clients, and I'm not really sure what the impact is to the community by doing something like that. Yeah, I think it serves the community, benefits the community at all, right? So but it certainly impacts our clients and their use of the property, you know, that's for sure. So
yeah, and I don't want to overstep, but I'll just, you know, I have a question for you, Elise, because when I read the memo from Garavalia, I read that they noted that if the board were comfortable with it, that these details of the skirting and the railing could be worked out at the staff level with you and with Garavalia, and didn't require going back to the board. I don't want to.
No, yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to. I'm just saying if it gives more time to think about the massing, and then because there's still work to be done before it goes to the planning commission. But
yeah. Yeah, I think it is that question of what does it mean to reduce the massing, because that's what we're kind of puzzling over, really. I mean, you know, we can look at taking the level of the roof down a little bit, we could look at that, but without asking our clients to give up significant program that is going to allow them to use the house in the way that the property in the way that they would like to. And again, I think we're still really, we're glad that you're feeling more comfortable with the idea of moving the cottage. We're very excited about the idea of letting the cottage just still be the cottage and not have a big addition onto it. It's, you know, that will forever change that building and that site. Irreversible. If we cut that thing in half and built, 1,500 square feet on the back of it, 2,000 square feet on the back of it, I don't know, because now the cottage isn't even 735 square feet. Now it's like 500 square feet if we have to take off the back of it in order to attach an addition to it. So, you know, we're also, I mean, we appreciate your conundrum of how to treat this thing, and that's where we've been, you know, in the 2 years that we've been working with Ellen and Steve on this project, 2.5 years we've been working with Ellen and Steve to get to this point.
Yeah, I think that part of the initial feeling here too is that there's a sizable commitment, and commitment means expense. to moving the cottage, putting a foundation under it, getting it up to kind of reasonable standards, so somebody could inhabit it. There's a level of care and ownership to that I don't see, doesn't seem like we're getting any kind of benefit for that, that concept, which I find a little taken back a little bit. So
You feel that you're not getting a benefit for being willing to preserve the cottage?
well, just I think to the extent that we are, right, that there is something that is of value about the cottage in its entirety that we appreciate. It's something that I don't think everybody. I think it would be a kind of a more of a rarity than, or the exception than the rule, essentially. So
I think what we're
I don't know.
we would think that somebody might be more inclined to modify it by adding on to it, which changes the interior, and I know we know that unless you are dealing with the National Register, the interior is not included in that. But this exercise does largely preserve the interior. We don't have to reconfigure the whole interior in order to do this. We do need to make the bathroom bigger because it's unworkable right now. But
is there anything else that the board would like to mention or consider in separate from massing, siding, roofing, lattice work?
Well, I think all of those issues are can be taken care of.
I agree.
Historic architects and deciding.
Yeah.
I was pretty convinced of Jerry's description of why it's stick style as opposed to batten and board, but it's a matter of which era you seem to pick as the one you want to preserve.
Yeah, and I was wondering about that. Do you ever have, maybe this is something that historic architects, if they're still around, can you combine? Because the stick seems like it's more like sort of like almost a design element. Can you combine board and batten and stick, or are they two completely separate styles?
Very, very different.
Okay. So it's a matter of choosing which era you want to emphasize. And of course, that comes back to it being related to Mr. Pixley. And, and he is like the main criteria, probably 60% of the reason why this house is so valuable. Do we go with his era or after he passes and his wife, and then Vera, his daughter, takes over? I don't know. I mean, it sounds like Garavaglia is recommending the board and batten, and Jerry Holland is recommending the stick.
Correct.
So, and the plans were drawn based on board and batten, it looks like, because I don't see any. I see a little bit of stick design
and like
on
the
cottage
dormer
remaining.
French, yeah. So it sounded like Jerry Holland had maybe seen some improvement since the last version C had seen, although it's clearly board and batten still. So maybe there's still something we could work out even with the materials.
I would like to see the historic architects' continued involvement with this project. That to me is an important condition. I personally don't see the value of reducing a bedroom from this project. I think this is the world that we live in now in Larkspur, is that there's going to be big houses that are going to be sort of expanding on the lot size. And, we're kind of the bulwark against overdevelopment, or we try to be, but I think we also have to be realistic, and that personally, I think this design is okay. That's my feeling. I do think it's a little bit modern, but it doesn't have to match the cottage. You know, I've been really, like you all have, I've been really thinking and mulling this over for a couple of years, knowing that this day would come. So, and it's pretty unavoidable that there's going to be some, whether it's attached to the cottage or whether it's separate, there was going to be something there. And it's not going to be the field, the bucolic setting that it was. And I don't know that even reducing the massing is going to satisfy that intrinsic desire that we all have to keep more of the country in Larkspur.
Well, I think we're going on and on. Either we continue it or we have a.
Right.
Um,
Well, I would actually, for me, should we take a motion on each of these actions? We could, you know what, I'm gonna go through all four of them. I'm gonna start with the fourth one, which is that it be denied. And we can just eliminate, and then we'll boil it down to one action that the board is gonna take. Does that sound like a good plan, everyone?
Fine.
Okay, so.
I'm trying to get to the right page again.
Okay, it's page 6 of the staff report. Heritage Preservation Board actions.
Yeah.
So number 4, if the standards of the LMC section 18.19 cannot be met, recommend that the application be denied. Okay, so do we want to deny this application? All in favor, say yay. Not in favor, say no.
No.
No. Okay. Okay, moving up. Number 3, continue the application to a specified date to allow the applicant the opportunity to modify the proposal to satisfy the standards of the Larkspur Municipal Code 18.19. Do we want to continue? Let's do this individually. So we'll just go through yay. Do we want to continue? I say no. Lelia?
I say no.
Carol?
No.
Sonia?
I don't know.
Rich?
I would continue. Yeah, I think you have to
Okay,
rule out, I think you have to rule out choice number 1, which is to approve outright.
Okay,
So you're left with approving with conditions or continuing with, in effect, conditions too, but you're approving it with stated conditions, which I'm not sure we're prepared to make.
right.
That's why, you know, a visit to the site and seeing more design options, I feel like is what we need.
Okay, so that would be continuing. Elise, help me out here. Or would that be number 2, conditions, the conditions being that we visit the site?
Well, no, but I think you have to say what are the conditions?
Yeah, if you're ready to make a motion to recommend approval with specific conditions, that would be an action that you could take tonight and it wouldn't return.
Yeah.
Okay. So it would be number 3.
I agree with Rich.
We're really not asking them to make a modification, are we?
We might not. This would be the meeting to have them further flesh out or explain it, as they said that they could, which might help us appreciate the.
And we're still not going to make a decision on moving the cottage?
I think we should. I think we should make that decision. I think we have to give them something to work with.
Me too.
So, all right. So it sounds like we are going to continue to a specified date, hopefully soon, to allow the applicant to meet with us. And I don't know, Rich, what else do you feel like?
Well,
we need?
I guess one of the things we have to remember here is that we've been guided by the professional historic consultant to the city, Jerry Holland, reliably for so much time that I put a lot of weight on her opinion about the historic question here, whether this can be approved. And I would like to see whatever changes have to be made to have an agreement by our historic architect. The fact that the city has gone to a third party with Mr. Gavalia is useful. I would have to say it's not like 2 to 1, though. I don't think that's really fair to characterize this. The Page Turnbull firm, for all of their experience, is after all an advocate for what's been proposed here, and their opinion is that this is acceptable. So I would, a discussion between the city's 2 consulting historic architects, if that could produce some kind of a consensus, that would guide me.
Me too.
Yeah, and I agree with you, Rich. I mean, I really always rely on Jerry Holland's opinion, and am not comfortable with going against what she recommends without some further study. So perhaps how would we to continue until consulting architects give us another report after this discussion?
Yeah, I mean, Elise, you had mentioned that Jerry hadn't, been at the most recent.
She hasn't seen the most recent design. And again, one of the things she had mentioned was, and I think that Rich is requesting too, is a consideration of the alternatives. And so maybe having those things discussed before you return, with the opportunity we could have a meeting at the site, a notice meeting where you could all attend. If we can set up a time when we can get you all out there, but that could be enough. We could do something that it has to be open to the public, but
yeah,
that's possible.
I think that would be good. But between now and that meeting, would Jerry have a chance to weigh in with Fisher Architects and maybe get a chance to see the changes that they've made in December?
I mean, if you'd like to see that, we could ask for that.
Yeah, I would. I'd like her to be brought more into it. I mean, I had hoped that she'd be a formal part of the meeting tonight. Yeah, if there's a way that she could be incorporated into some of the planning, and I am sympathetic with the homeowner, and I don't want to drag out this process any longer than it has to, but I do think that this is such a major project. It's not like it's just a windows or replacing a roof. So maybe it's worth it to continue it and to bring in Jerry Holland in a more formal way.
So, but just to be specific enough for the applicants, so to study the revised elevations, because she hasn't seen those, and then have them discuss more of the alternatives that were considered.
Yeah.
And then, and would you like to set up something where you can meet at the site to discuss the project with the architect?
Yeah.
Yes, that'd be a good idea.
Okay.
So the story, because the story polls were just set up. I mean, I went over there, what day was it? Wednesday? No, Monday. And they hadn't even,
the
working
storm
on
was a
setting
little
them
bit
up.
of a delay.
And then with the rain and everything, I think, and the site was really muddy and part of it was like fenced off and I didn't dare go on the porch. So I think it would be nice to be able to, walk around the site with the architect, have them point out exactly where the roof line was, because that was confusing to me too. Yeah, and it would have to be during the daylight, of course, so we can see it.
Yeah. Definitely.
And I don't know if you have calendars and want to do something here. We could send out a doodle poll with some days and times.
Yep.
Can we make a condition of this continuation that that we're seeking consensus between the city's two historic architects? I mean, I assume both Gevalia and Holland are still on the city's contract for this project. Is that right?
Or we're consulting with both of them.
I mean, that's part of I think our dilemma here is we've got two reliable historic historians disagreeing about the merits of the project.
Well, I think it would be easier if it wasn't the disagreement over moving the structure. But it's worth having a conversation with them to see if, especially they've heard what you've said tonight, that maybe there is some common ground on some of the other items.
I would like to see that.
So is that enough of them, or do we need to vote on a motion, or are we settled on the next step?
The motion to continue, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have to give specifics of what we'd like to see in the next meeting.
Well, it sounds like the next meeting will be an on-site meeting.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to hear from the applicant to see if they're okay with that, just to, if that's acceptable to them?
Sure.
No, I do not.
Okay.
Well, can I make a motion that we continue this discussion at an in-person meeting on site with the architects?
I'll second it.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 No,
What would you like different, Rich?
I would amend the motion. I would amend the motion to include consideration by the city's consultants that there be a consensus. And I'm not sure that that's out of the question. I think that may be something that can be achieved.
What happens if they can't have a consensus?
Then I think it comes to us. We have to hear both sides having attempted to come to a consensus to be able to make a decision.
So you've amended the motion?
Yes, I do amend it.
I can second that.
So the amended motion to continue with a site visit and a consensus between the two consulting historic architects.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
All right, all in favor? Aye.
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 Okay, looks like the motion carried. All of the members here voted aye for the motion. And so I'll send out a doodle poll to see if we can get a date set up where you can meet the architect on site, and we would open that up to the public as the Brown Act
Right.
requires.
Right.
Well, another important thing is that the consultants have to have the time to meet and confer and to advise us.
And make sure they all have the latest editions of the revised plans.
And that they attend a site visit.
Yeah, I think that will be useful too.
Yeah,
It would be,
I think
yeah.
so.
Okay. I understand what our next steps are.
Okay, so getting back to other business. I think we have some meeting notes that we need to approve. Did everyone get a copy and have a chance to review the meeting minutes?
The minutes. I move that we accept the minutes as written.
I second. All in favor?
Aye.
Yeah. Is there anyone else that wants to bring up any other Heritage Board business tonight?
Not at 10:30.
This is the longest board meeting we've had in a long time.
I expected it was going to be long. Okay, so I think that's everything. I think that concludes our meeting tonight. Right, Elise?
Yes, that's it.
Okay.
We need a
Thank you all.
motion to adjourn or.
Oh, motion to adjourn. Yeah, you can make a motion to adjourn.
I move that we adjourn.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
I'll agree.
Aye. All right.
Good work, folks. Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.